Chapter 570. I saw a post in the book review section and was very angry and sad. I wrote a very long piece of gossip. After calmly thinking for a long time, I decided to delete it all because today is a joyous day. I will continue not to look at the book review section. Unfortunately, I may miss many good book reviews. After all, the leader also has to go to work. He can't keep an eye on it all the time. Everyone can also post the book reviews they value to the club. The club is in the relevant club on the right side of the page. It's called Qing Yun Yen, Cat Fan, Old P, Yuan, and Bachelor. Those good managers will certainly value it very much. Thank you for your hard work. Add a sentence. After I finished writing yesterday afternoon, I found that I was sick again, so those who said I was pretending to be sick can continue. Then, I sincerely call for monthly votes to everyone. Those who scolded me for not writing enough and dragging on and still have the nerve to ask for votes can also continue. I wish everyone a happy life and a happy Olympics. I will continue to write this story seriously. Please read it happily. Qin Heng's body hung from Jing Ji's spear. Fresh blood dripped down. In this moment, his chest was filled with the joy of revenge and the smell of blood. He wanted to shout to his heart's content in this encirclement of tens of thousands of soldiers. He had finally avenged his family. After hiding in the darkness for so many years, he had finally avenged his family. Outside Jiaozhou, he had told Fan Xian of his past for the first time. Half a year later, Fan Xian had quietly promised to give him a chance for revenge. Jing Gu didn't know what power Sir Fan Jr. had to help him fulfill his wish, but his wish had finally become reality. Joy, boundless joy, and murderous intent made Jing Gu laugh happily. The wretched wound had split open between his ears like a clown's mouth. Because of his laughter, it opened wider and wider. It looked particularly terrifying and miserable. Tears rolled down his face like rain. The people who saw this scene all felt a chill rise from the depths of their hearts. Riding on the horse, the old Qin master's heart felt like it was being torn apart. His vision darkened, but he valiantly sat straight on the horse. He did not let anyone notice that he was almost unable to endure the mental decline. The old Qin master's face was pale and his white hair fluttered in the wind. He looked at his only son, who had been stabbed by the monstrous Shadow Knight's spear, without saying a word. At this moment, the second scene in the scene that was quietly changing like an undercurrent in the imperial city also changed. It was as if a divine painter was splashing ink all over the mountains, sprinkling tens of thousands of vermilion dots. Suddenly, countless wildflowers bloomed in the mountains, turning from a desolate scene to a bountiful harvest. The main palace gate was smashed open by the rebel army's heavy chariots. The rebel army was shouting as they charged inside. However, a large blade was swung out from the palace gate, bringing with it a cold light and a streak of blood. Several heads fell to the ground. He waved his broadsword again. In a flash of cold light, the silver-armored first prince rode on his horse. With an indomitable aura, he leaped out of the palace gates like a god, his broadsword opening up a bloody path. Creak, creak, creak. The heads of the vanguard of the rebel army fell. The first prince gave a roar. Holding the long broadsword in his hand, he led the 200 imperial soldiers behind him in a sudden charge. Unexpectedly, the moment the palace gates were broken open, they charged out first. This was the first true attack of the people in the royal palace. The sound of horse hooves thundering rang out. Although only a small path had been cleared out of the mountain rocks and sand inside the palace gates, it did not stop the speed of the first prince's counterattack. The 200 imperial soldiers quickly rode out. Relying on their high-speed charge and excellent riding skills, they broke open a large gap in the vanguard of the rebel army in front of the palace gates like a knife cutting through tofu. Wherever the cold light passed, no one could stop it. Those who dared were turned into corpses and severed limbs on the ground. In just an instant, the Imperial soldiers had charged out nearly 200 feet from the suddenly opened palace gates. Like a silver stream, they were unstoppable. At this time, the rebel army had already begun to charge toward the broken palace gates. They were densely packed like locusts filling the sky, making one shiver in fear. Although the 200 Imperial soldiers were powerful, in front of such a powerful rebel army, they were only as thick as a silver thread. However, the first prince was not afraid. Since he trusted Fan Xian, he had already cast aside his own life and death. As he charged, he flipped his wrist. The broadsword drew an arc in the air and chopped straight down toward his right. With a crisp crack, the short spear in a rebel army officer's hand snapped in half. The broadsword chopped into the officer's shoulder. The first prince furrowed his brows and gave a muffled grunt. Gathering strength from his waist, he moved his arm. With a swish, the blade of the broadsword broke out of his body and immediately chopped the officer's body in half. Immediately after, the first prince bent his body and avoided a spiked stick flying toward his face. At this moment, he dragged the broadsword in his hand behind him and spun it around his waist. Using his powerful arm strength, he chopped down diagonally. The edge of the broadsword whistled through the air and domineeringly chopped off the head of the rebel soldier on his left. With a light slap, countless drops of blood sprayed onto the first prince's silver armor. The long broadsword in his hand was also stained with thick blood. The silver and red added together was just like the bright red cloak he usually liked to wear. Following the Imperial soldiers' desperate attack, it became a line of blood. It appeared exceptionally shocking and magnificent. His helmet pressed down on the first prince's sword-like brows. A wildfire burned in his eyes. Bravely and unstoppably, he led his subordinates and charged toward the rebel army's camp in the distance. Who knew how many obstructions and killings he would encounter along the way? Perhaps he would never be able to charge in front of Li Qingqian, but he still had to charge. He was the commander of the Qing Kingdom's Western Expedition Army and the only person of the royal family who had experience on the battlefield. Even if he didn't understand Fan Xian's intentions, since he had accepted this mission, he had to see it through to the end. He was not a martial ace, but he was a fierce general in the army. The attack and defense battles in Jingdo could not bring out his ability to command in field battles. However, the first prince had never been afraid of charging and breaking through enemy lines. Horse fighting skills on the battlefield were completely different from battles between aces. What was important was momentum. The first prince's momentum had, without question, been raised to its peak by his determination to die. As a child of mixed blood between Dongyi and the Qing kingdom, from a certain point of view, he was not favored by the emperor. However, he had strong feelings for this land. An arrow shot out from the dark and was chopped aside by the tip of his broadsword. However, it caused his figure to pause. The countless spears of the rebel soldiers below his horse drew a few bloody wounds on his body. Fortunately, the horse was fast and did not fall into the encirclement. Instead, he killed his way through and continued charging toward the rebel army camp. There was still a long way to go, but the 200 Imperial soldiers gave one the feeling that they would charge in front of the crown prince in the next moment. Fan Xian stood on the black coffin and watched everything below the palace walls nervously. When the great prince charged into his field of vision through the palace doors below the palace walls, he immediately gave an order. Open the way for His Highness. There were not many Imperial soldiers and Overwatch Council subordinates left on the palace walls. Most of them were doing their best to hold out against the rebel soldiers climbing up the palace walls using ladders. Relying on the 4 hours of preparation in the early hours of the morning, not a single rebel soldier had climbed to the top of the palace walls. However, they had long received military orders. Although they were secretly afraid, they still carried out Fan Xian's orders without any delay. They left the area of the palace walls they were guarding and quickly moved toward the center. They fired out the few arrows in their hands without holding back at all. The arrows were concentrated like rain, all of them landing in front of the great prince's imperial army's path of attack. They all landed on the heads of the rebel soldiers and immediately caused great damage. It also reduced the resistance on the great prince's path of attack. However, the defenses in the other areas of the royal palace became weaker. Without the protection of arrows, the rebel soldiers on the ladder seemed to have taken stimulants. They climbed bravely and were about to reach the top of the palace walls. The imperial soldiers pulled their bowstrings with all their might. They could not feel the pain in their arms or the blood on their fingers from the vibrations of the bowstrings. They were under Duke Fan's orders to use the bows and arrows in their hands to open the way for the prince. What if the rebel soldiers attacked the royal palace? The prince was leading 200 brothers in an attack amidst the encirclement of the rebel soldiers. If their bows and arrows slowed for a moment and the prince was injured, what would happen? Terror, unease, heroism, and all kinds of emotions rolled through the hearts of the imperial soldiers on the palace walls. The rebel soldiers had already climbed up the ladders to the top of the palace walls. Although there were not many people on the palace walls, they were all good men of the Qin family's army. With great difficulty, they found their footing and began to expand their positions to open a path for the rebel soldiers behind them. At the palace gate below the palace walls, the 200 imperial soldiers had already charged out. The rebel soldiers could not stop them, so they charged in through the broken palace gate and fought with the remaining defensive forces in the palace. The royal palace was about to fall, and the great prince was still charging through the rebel soldiers below the palace walls. At this moment, there were two muffled hums. The two giant city-guarding crossbows, which had stopped for a while, finally began to fire again. This time, the fire was not aimed at the battered carriages charging through the gate or the three-section cloud carriages being transported in. Instead, under Fan Xian's strong request, they all landed among the rebel soldiers, right in front of the great prince's path of attack. It was just like where the imperial soldiers' arrows were pointing. The giant crossbows landed and pierced through the bodies of countless rebel soldiers, sending up waves of bloody mist. They then stabbed heavily into the stone slabs. Some bounced up. The massive weight and powerful force of impact were enough to crush a few people to death. The sudden powerful rain of arrows and the terrifyingly powerful crossbow bolts greatly supported the great prince's attack. They opened up a bloody path right in the middle of the rebel army. The great prince led the imperial army. Like a silver line, they followed this bloody path and bravely attacked the rebel army's camp. The rebel soldiers clearly had the advantage in numbers. Seeing the great prince's magnificent and heroic figure on the horse, they felt their hearts tremble for no reason. The Qing army placed the most importance on military service. Everyone knew that for many years, it was this great prince who had led the army in battle against the Hu people on the western frontier. He had never tasted defeat and had performed a great service for the Qin kingdom. The great prince had also become a famous general in the army. The sense of pressure and force of impact created by a famous general leading an attack was not something a normal person could stand against. Fan Xian looked at the heroic scene and took a deep breath. The two slowly moving circulations in his body suddenly sped up. He gradually removed the layer of Tianyi Dao Xinqi from the meridians in his body and allowed the ruthless and tyrannical Xinqi to begin to circulate valiantly through his body. The blood veins in his eyes grew thicker and thicker. The effect of the medicine had reached its peak. He gripped the grappling hook in his hand tightly and waited for the sound of the last crossbow bolt. Jinggu, who had killed Qin Heng, had already been surrounded by the rebel soldiers who had arrived first. The old Qin master coldly and listlessly pulled back his gaze and turned it toward the chaos in front of him that was still far away. He knew that the great prince had already begun to lead the counterattack. He knew how wild and heroic the great prince's battle style was. If the other side still had 3,000 riders, perhaps the old Qin master would temporarily avoid the other side's attack. However, the rebel army's victory was already set. They had already broken through the palace gates on the city walls. At such a critical moment, the old Qin master would not retreat even one step. This was a natural intuition formed after decades on the battlefield. Looking at the great prince's blood-soaked heroic figure and thinking of the scene of his only son's tragic death earlier, the old Qin master suddenly felt that he had grown old. He was even about to smell the scent of death. The pain that had been hidden deep in his heart made him make a wrong decision after a moment of hesitation. The enemy's final crazy counterattack cannot be underestimated. The old Qin master coughed and said to his trusted family general, "Take the crown prince to the back of the camp." The crown prince glanced at the old Qin master. He originally did not want to retreat, but the crown prince did not know military affairs and was unwilling to interfere with old General Qin's troops at such a critical moment. He could only leave quietly. The old Qin master was an old general on the battlefield. When the great prince's final counterattack came, he chose to be as still as a mountain. It was naturally the best decision. However, personally seeing the tragedy of his only son's death made him more conservative. He had his family general lead the crown prince to temporarily avoid the great prince's counterattack. With this, there were only 8 Qin family generals left at his side. Perhaps, as a 9th-level ace, the old Qin master did not care about anything. But Fan Xian cared. The massive city-guarding crossbows had finally used up all of their arrows. The rain of arrows from the imperial army had also become sparse. The imperial army troops led by the great prince, after paying a heavy price, were still unable to break into the rebel army's camp. Perhaps miracles could happen on the battlefield, but to rely on 200 riders to carry out a successful counterattack was no longer a miracle. It was wishful thinking. The great prince had fought until now, bathed in blood. He had already killed a long, bloody path. His valiant battle abilities on the battlefield had already scared countless rebel soldiers to death. At this moment, the royal palace was about to fall. The great prince was surrounded. The remaining Black Knights and Jingu were surrounded. The situation was already set. Even the sound of the last city-guarding crossbow was very different from the previous dozen arrows. It flew out at an angle and gave off a sorrowful whimper. After the last arrow was shot, the 2 city-guarding crossbows fell silent. Everyone seemed to clearly hear the sorrowful sound of the arrow and capture the trajectory of the arrow as it tore through the air. No one noticed that the trajectory of this arrow was completely different from the one that had opened up a path for the great prince. This arrow flew at an angle and swept over the heads of all the rebel soldiers. It did not cause any damage. Instead, it slowly used up its energy in the air. After flying a long distance, it landed heavily in front of the rebel army camp. Although the arrow had flown far, it did not pose any threat. In the end, it fell miserably to the ground like a piece of scrap metal. It did not hit a single rebel soldier. It only gave them a fright. With a muffled pop, the arrow was like a child playing with a knife. The lucky arrow pointed downward and pierced into the earth between the stone slabs, standing upright. At this moment, everyone on and below the city wall saw a scene that made their hearts tremble. A black-clothed person floated down from above the imperial city like a ghost emerging from the depths of the earth. Following the trajectory of the crossbow arrow, he swiftly flew down from the imperial city in the air where there was no point of contact. The black-clothed person moved very quickly. It was as if he was tearing through the air. From high above the palace walls, in the blink of an eye, he flew to the top of the rebel army's battle formation. The end of the last arrow had a rope tied to it. The black-clothed person used a grappling hook to slide down along the rope and kill his way into the rebel army camp. Like a black god descending, this scene dumbfounded countless people. They were intimidated by the powerful killing intent and aura in the air. Finally, someone reacted and discovered the rope tied to the end of the last arrow that had fallen heavily to the ground. He roared, "Cut the rope!" Numerous bright knives chopped at the rope tied tightly to the end of the arrow. The old Chain Master's gaze grew slightly cold. Looking at the black shadow charging at him with incredible speed, the pain and anger in his heart exploded once again. His body trembled. The first prince's courageous attack and the black-clothed man's descent from the sky had unavoidably distracted him. In particular, the tragic death of his only son had caused this powerful figure to finally reveal a gap in his state of mind. Just as the old Chain Master's state of mind trembled slightly, a knife light also lit up at the corner of his eyes. This knife light was not chopping toward the rope at the end of the arrow. Instead, it was chopping toward the old Chain Master's body. A muffled crack exploded in the rebel army camp. Gong Dian's armor clanked wildly from the Jinchi in his body. The powerful Jinchi made his hair stand on end. His hands gripped the straight knife in his hands tightly and chopped toward the old Chain Master's neck. This strike contained all of the power in Gong Dian's body. The power at the peak of the 8th level exploded into this strike that he had waited many years for. A glimmer of anger and disbelief flashed through the old Chain Master's eyes. His face flushed red as his hand clamped down tightly on Gong Dian's brutal strike. Fresh blood dripped from between the old Chain Master's thumb and index finger. Faced with this extremely sinister assassination attempt, the first elder of the Qing army, a superior 9th level ace, still trembled like he had when he saw Fan Xian descend from the sky. With just a slight tremble, the old Chain Master's flushed face immediately became a deathly white. Gong Dian could no longer hold on to his long knife. There was another person who attacked at the same time as Gong Dian. A very heavy and powerful person. Yi Zhong's attack was very heavy. It was so heavy that it seemed to carry with it the wind and sand of the Dingzhou desert. It carried with it some mysterious intent. Decisively and mercilessly, it tore apart the body of a rebel general between him and the old Chain Master and struck the old Chain Master's abdomen. Yi Zhong and Gong Dian attacked the old Chain Master at the same time. This scene happened too suddenly, too strangely, and too unbelievable. Even the old Chain Master did not understand what meaning it contained. His personal family warriors had already escorted the crown prince to the side palace, but the 8 generals at his side could not react at all. After this massive muffled sound, dust and smoke rose up in the rebel army camp. The dust and smoke settled slightly. The 3 warhorses under the 3 people were shaken by the powerful Jinchi. They didn't even have time to cry out before they exploded and died. The old Chain Master spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. A terrifying wound appeared on his abdomen. His hand, which had quickly reached down like a withered bamboo, was already tightly gripping Yi Zhong's wrist that held the knife. Yi Zhong lowered his head. His brows were as steady as a mountain. The Jinchi in his body flowed out without holding back. With a muffled grunt, he took a step forward and pressed down again. The old Chain Master's body trembled again. A powerful force exploded out from his old body. His left elbow flicked out. Holding Gong Dian's steel knife in his hand, the tip of his elbow had already smashed ruthlessly into Gong Dian's chest. With a pft, Gong Dian spat out a mist of blood that filled the air. However, he borrowed the momentum of spitting out blood to let out an explosive roar. Without any regard for his own safety, he pressed his entire body forward. With a press of the blade, the old Chain Master's left hand was pressed against his neck, giving off a terrifying creaking sound. All of this happened in a very short amount of time. Yi Zhong knew that he only had one chance. Given his mountain-like personality, he would not pass it up. He took a deep breath and his chest expanded. His left hand shook and quickly became like a metal plate, breaking free of the old Qin master's unusually powerful control. This left hand became a metal plate. With the power of a coffin breaker, it landed heavily on the old Qin master's bleeding chest wound. The Yi family's hand skills were the best in the world. The powerful force of impact pushed the three top aces of the Qin military back on the stone floor. Along the way, they shattered the ground and sent up smoke and dust. At this moment, the rope behind the crossbow had been cut. Fan Xian, dressed in black, fell from midair. However, he did not fall into the encirclement of the rebel soldiers. Instead, the tip of his foot pushed off the helmet of a rebel soldier. Like a streak of smoke, he pierced straight into the rebel camp. Yi Zhong's coffin breaker landed viciously on the wound in the old Qin master's waist. Fan Xian shrunk into a ball of black shadow and immediately unfurled. With two swishing sounds, his left hand pulled out the sword of the Wei Emperor tied to his back. His right hand pulled out the black dagger he had taken from Lady Ning. With a sword in one hand and a dagger in the other, he turned into a streak of black smoke and swept past the heads of the 8 Qin family generals in the rebel camp. With a number of crisp sounds, 5 of the generals died with their throats slit. 3 of them retreated with chest injuries. Although it was only one exchange, Fan Xian had already unleashed the most power he had since his rebirth. Like a giant bird returning to the forest, he flew toward the 3 people fighting like wild beasts. The old Qin master, who was injured, let out a wild roar. With a flip of his hand, he pulled back his fingers and struck heavily on Yi Zhong's left shoulder, who did not care for his life and did not care about defense. The strike shattered Yi Zhong's left shoulder. The foot under his body stomped heavily on the ground, leaving a footprint, and brought his body flying backward. Yi Zhong gave a muffled grunt. Using the coffin breaker technique of closing the coffin, he locked onto the old Qin master's wildly overflowing and endlessly trembling right hand. Gong Dian's entire body was covered in blood. He wrapped one hand around the old Qin master's left arm and stuck his body to it. He used his body to press down on the 2 knives between the 2 of them. Through the old Qin master's powerful palm, he pressed down toward his neck. The 3 of them tangled together and quickly retreated over 30 meters. With a crash, they smashed through the wall of a wooden building at the back of the square and sent up countless clouds of dust. However, someone was faster than them. Fan Xian flew in like a black bird and arrived in front of the old Qin master like lightning. The long sword in his hand flipped and pierced into the old Qin master's lower abdomen with a clang. Blood blossomed as the long sword entered the body. Fan Xian lowered his head to hold the sword. With a muffled grunt, he continued to stab forward. The powerful force caused the bodies of the 4 warriors to smash through the second wall of the building, the third wall, and sent up countless clouds of dust. It hid this sinister, shameless, and bloody murder in a place where tens of thousands of people could not see. The buildings and scenery around them flowed like they were going back in time. Fan Xian, Yi Zhong, and Gong Dian did not let go. Although these 3 sinister assassins knew that the old Qin master had suddenly been ambushed and had suffered injuries that were difficult to recover from under the combined attack of 2 9th-level aces and an 8th-level brave warrior, no one could predict what kind of brilliance this elder of the Qin military would explode within the last moments of his life. With a muffled boom, this barbaric assassination was finally stopped in front of the last wall. Yi Zhong continued to use the coffin breaker technique to tightly grip the old Qin master's most powerful right hand. Gong Dian continued to press down on the old Qin master's left arm. Fan Xian still maintained his half-crouched stabbing position. His hands trembled as he held the blood-covered sword. Only the hilt of the sword was exposed outside the old Qin master's abdomen. The old Qin master's grizzled hair was disheveled, but a terrifying light still shone in his eyes. Like an old lion king on the verge of death, he suddenly let out an angry roar. His entire body began to tremble violently. The last counterattack of a 9th level ace before death used this kind of violent tremor as an omen. From the wooden wall behind him, the tip of a sword suddenly and noiselessly extended out. The tip of the sword only protruded out 4 inches, but it just so happened to pierce into the old Qin master's body, the 3rd section of his tailbone. This mysterious sword thrust out and then retracted, disappearing without a trace. However, it was a fatal blow. Chapter 571. Silence. A death-like silence. Perhaps it was very long. Perhaps it was only an instant. Looking back 30 years, looking closer, it was 2 or 3 years. The wood shavings and broken pieces of tables and chairs that had been shattered by the Jinqi all around them fell with a rustle. Blood dripped down. Fan Xian slowly pulled out the sharp sword. The blade scraped against flesh and blood, making a wretched sound. Yi Zhong let go of the pair of iron hands. Gong Dian stood up, coughing up blood. The old Qin master's eyes were wide open. His body was soaked in blood as he sat by the wall. He had died with his eyes open. His hands were slightly open as if he was grabbing onto something. This elder figure of the Qing military had finally died. He had died in the most sinister murder that had been planned and hidden for the longest time since the founding of the Qing kingdom. Fan Xian was not injured at all, but he felt his body become slightly cold. Raising his head, he glanced at the silent Gong Dian to his right with a strange gaze. He looked at the first official of the guards he had met since he entered the capital at the age of 16. It was like he was looking at a monster. Then, he turned his head and glanced at Yi Zhong. He looked at Yi Zhong heavily. Coincidentally, Yi Zhong was also looking at him. Their gazes met. There were no sparks, but they each carried a sense of understanding, insight, and probing. Fan Xian knew that, in some sense, his gamble had already completely succeeded. The reason he dared to gamble on the royal palace was not because he already had some inside information. It was because when he had pressed down on the Empress Dowager's foot, he had thought of his grandmother's words in Danzhou. The emperor never fought a battle unprepared. The emperor's willpower was powerful beyond imagination. The emperor did not have any weaknesses. When Fan Xian was faced with a desperate situation, he did not believe that the emperor would not have left any backup in Jingdou. The emperor clearly knew the situation in Jingdou. How could he still go to Dong Mountain to worship heaven? Fan Xian wanted to gamble. He was gambling that some unexpected changes would occur in the rebel army. The changes had finally occurred. The Yi family had rebelled. No, it should be said that the most valiant spies in the history of the Qin kingdom had surfaced. However, when Fan Xian decided to gamble, he still could not convince himself why the Yi family would suddenly intervene, until he saw those things in Yi Zhong's eyes. Perhaps this glance only took a second, but it was enough for Fan Xian to understand many things. In the past, all the questions he had once doubted, all the things in the Qin court that appeared strange these 4 years, which proved the emperor's paranoia and exposed his flaws, all received a perfect explanation. Fan Xian only looked at Yi Zhong for a second, but he had already seen through everything that had happened in the past few years, even more than a decade. A month ago, at the foot of Dong Mountain, Yi Luyun had come in a boat breaking through the waves. A sword came from beyond the heavens. It broke through the rocks and entered the precipice. Only the hilt of the sword remained outside the wall. At that time, Fan Xian was standing on the reef. He had been wounded by an arrow and had luckily escaped by sinking into the sea. Last year, in Suzhou, in the Baoyue brothel, Yi Luyun arrived wearing a bamboo hat. With one sword, he cut down half the building. For the sake of the Juanshan conference, he forcefully took away the accountant. At that moment, Fan Xian let loose a torrent of curses. He suffered internal injuries, but fortunately, he did not die. Given Yi Liuyun's abilities and the might of a great grandmaster, he had allowed Fan Xian to meet him twice and not die. Using this as a line, it was clear to see the past events of the Qin kingdom. 2 years ago, while admiring chrysanthemums in the Hanging Temple, Gong Dian strangely left his post. There was a sudden assassination aimed at the Qing emperor. The building was in chaos, and Fan Xian was heavily injured. Yi Zhong gave chase but failed. The court was shocked, and the emperor was furious. He stripped Yi Zhong of his position as commander of the Jingdou garrison and sent him back to Dingzhou. Gong Dian was imprisoned and luckily returned. 2 years and 2 months ago, Fan Xian learned of the marriage between the second prince and Yi Ling in Shangjing. He was shocked and thought that the emperor was trying to force Yi Zhong to resign from his post so he would not be involved in the affairs of the princes. From this, it went back to 8 years ago. At that time, Fan Xian was 12. On a cliff in Danzhou, he was bitterly practicing the tyrannical martial method. At that time, the singer Lu Yun had come and used Sanzhou to compare notes with Wu Zhu. After the Hanging Temple incident, Fan Xian and Chen Pingping had a long night of conversation. They both knew that the emperor had purposely arranged this matter to suppress the Yi family, remove Gong Dian from his position as deputy commander of the imperial army, and force Yi Zhong to leave Jingdou. At the time, Qi and Chen Pingping were confused. They thought that the emperor was too suspicious, but they also thought that this was a struggle between imperial power and the great grandmasters, so they did not think about it carefully. In dealing with the matter of the Yi family, the Qing emperor had clearly exposed his weakness of being overly suspicious. Although the method he used was obscure, it also lost its righteous style. At this moment, Fan Xian thought of the singer he first met when he was 12. He had long thought through all of this and finally understood. The emperor's paranoia, the emperor's blunder, was purposely showing weakness. Through the alienation of the Yi family, it gave the enemies under heaven the courage to attack. In 8 years, Fan Xian had never seriously thought about why of the 4 great grandmasters, the first one he saw was Yi Luyun. He had also never thought about why Yi Luyun, traveling the world, would go to Danzhou and so easily find Uncle Wu Zhu, whom many people wanted to find but could not. Where was Wu Zhu? No one under heaven knew, but some people knew that wherever Fan Xian was, Wu Zhu would be there. At that time, the only people who knew Fan Xian's true identity were the emperor, Chen Pingping, and Fan Jian. Analyzing to this point, he understood everything. Yi Luyun had gone to Danzhou because someone had told him that Yi Qingmei's son was in Danzhou. Naturally, Wu Zhu was also in Danzhou. The person who had told him all of this was the emperor. In other words, the emperor had solemnly asked Yi Luyun to go to Danzhou and see his illegitimate child with a strange background. Naturally, such a person was the emperor's most trusted person. How could such a person betray the emperor? The emperor's paranoia, the Yi family's alienation, the marriage between the second prince and Yi Ling, and Yi Liuyun's sudden change in direction. All of this was actually just an illusion, or perhaps it was a price that had to be paid. These were just the details that made up a perfect infernal affairs. This plan had probably been constructed for a year, 2 years, 3 years. If one thought of Yi Liuyun's identity as a guest of the Juanshan conference, the time this plan had probably begun was more than a dozen years ago. Using such a long time and paying such a heavy price to hide it from everyone under heaven, including himself and the eldest princess's eyes, it could be said that this was the most terrifying infernal affairs in the history of the Qin kingdom. Compared to this, what did the Overwatch Council's Yan Ruohai and Yuan Hongdao count for? In just a second, countless images flashed through Fan Xian's mind. He withdrew his gaze and looked at the calm Yi Zhong. His body suddenly felt a chill as if he had fallen into an ice house. Even Chen Pingping probably did not know of this plan. The emperor's willpower was truly too terrifying. He looked at Yi Zhong. His lips were dry. From his clothes, he took out his special token and handed it over. In a trembling voice, he asked, "Is the emperor still alive?" At that moment, Yi Zhong was also looking at the young duke. His emotions were complicated. When he had first attacked the old Qin master, he had not thought that Fan Xian on the palace walls would be able to mobilize the power to cooperate with him. His heart was also filled with shock. Had the emperor already told Sir Fan Jr. the entire plan? When Fan Xian opened his mouth, Yi Zhong asked at the same time, "Is the emperor still alive?" The exact same two questions shocked Fan Xian and Yi Zhong at the same time. Looking into each other's eyes, they felt a chill. Only now did they know that no one in Jingdo, regardless of whether it was Fan Xian, whom the emperor trusted incomparably, or Yi Zhong, the most important person in this plan, did not know whether the emperor was alive or dead. "Where is Li Yunrui?" Taiping courtyard. The two of them stopped talking. Yi Zhong accepted Fan Xian's token. Gong Dian picked up the old Qin master's body and quickly left in the direction of the square, where the sounds of killing had already shaken the heavens. Only a moment had passed since the assassination of Qin Yi. The people involved thought a lot. However, the formal conversation only consisted of these two sentences. The first sentence from both sides had already explained too many problems. Everyone was only a pawn in a large chessboard. They just had to do their part. Man proposes, God disposes. For now, they didn't know the situation at Dong Mountain and didn't need to think about it. Fan Xian took a few heavy breaths and forcefully suppressed the irritation brought about by the tyrannical Jinqi and medicine in his body. He dispersed some of the coldness in his heart and did not notice the small hole in the wall. For such a plan, the emperor had planned it for such a long time and exhausted so much energy. Naturally, the plan was great. Eliminating all opposition within the Qin kingdom was one part, but the emperor's true goal was probably far from that. Using Chen Pingping's words, in this world, only the emperor stood at the highest and saw the furthest. Given the emperor's gaze, during these decades, he had always looked at the beautiful and elegant sights of the world, particularly the lands and people that temporarily did not belong to him. The main target of the Yi family's seamless plan was probably northern Qi and Dongyi. Ku He and Sigurd Jian were both present on Dong Mountain, but Yi Luyun was the emperor's underling. The entire situation of the world had probably undergone a world-shaking change on that mountain. However, there were still some things Fan Xian did not understand. Even though Yi Luyun had abruptly turned against him at Dong Mountain, Ku He and Sigurd Jian were extraordinary figures. With the four great grandmasters at Dong Mountain, even if Ku He and Sigurd Jian were at a disadvantage, how could they be taken in by the emperor? Fan Xian furrowed his brows. It looked like the emperor had chosen Dong Mountain as the place to gather the overall situation. Most importantly, he was counting on Uncle Wu Zhu to take action. He knew Uncle Wu Zhu's personality. He would probably disappoint the emperor. The wretched cries of killing came from behind him and pulled him out of his complicated emotions. It reminded him that he was still beside the battlefield. The situation in Jingdo had not been settled. There were still countless people spilling hot blood for a plot that had been woven for many years. He took another deep breath and temporarily stopped thinking about the problem of Dong Mountain. Breaking through the wall, he disappeared into the heavy cover of private residences. In the instant before he moved, he suddenly felt a wave of sorrow. He suddenly felt sympathy for the eldest princess, the crown prince, the second prince, and the Qing soldiers fighting desperately in front of the royal palace. He also began to feel sympathy for himself. For the battle in Jingdo to reach such a level of ferocity, how much damage would it do to the Qin kingdom's national strength? Had the emperor, whose life and death was unknown, really not calculated? The 4 great grandmasters were at Dong Mountain. Even if the power of a sleeve or a finger was enough to shake the heavens and earth, could the emperor still be alive? Why did he take such a great risk and expend so much energy to do such a thing? Was it really to unify the world? Was it just for the title of Master of the World? At the same time that Yi Zhong, Gong Jia, and Fan Xian were assassinating the old Qin master, the middle-ranking Dingzhou generals, who had been silent the entire time, all met each other's eyes. They saw the determination and confusion in each other's eyes. It was not until the moment they entered the city that these generals had secretly received Commander Yi and General Gong's secret orders. In order to keep it a secret, it was impossible to mobilize the lower-ranking soldiers. However, the Yi family's Dingzhou army had to attack. They had already seen the strange scene in the rebel army's camp. However, soldiers were not robots that only listened to orders. For any army, when they were about to turn on the battlefield without any pre-battle mobilization, they would all appear confused. A moment ago, they were preparing to attack the royal palace. In the next moment, they suddenly had to turn their spears toward their own comrades. No matter how strict the military discipline of the Dingzhou army was, their battle power would probably drop to a very low point. Fortunately, the Dingzhou army's outstanding deputy generals and the middle-ranking generals who knew the inside story were talented enough to partially solve the problem of who they were fighting for. They isolated the second prince's trusted aides outside and surrounded the second prince. In a loud voice, they yelled, "The second prince has an order. The crown prince has killed the monarch and his father. He is worse than a pig or a dog. Any Qing kingdom soldier can rise up and attack him. Kill." It was not until now that the second prince realized something was wrong. His face immediately paled. He didn't know why these generals, who had always been respectful and courteous, had surrounded him. He also didn't know why they had suddenly given such an absurd military order. Did his father-in-law see that the royal palace had opened and wanted to use this opportunity to get rid of the crown prince and help him ascend the throne? The second prince comforted himself like this in his heart. Only when he saw his trusted aide being shot down by the Dingzhou army and tied up on horseback did his heart grow cold. He knew that a change that neither he nor the crown prince had expected had occurred. Once the military order came out, the common soldiers of the Dingzhou army reacted quickly and attacked the Qin family's troops. Perhaps a portion of them actually believed this military order and thought that the crown prince's assassination plot had finally been exposed. The second prince had learned from his painful experience and decided to avenge the previous emperor. Most of the common soldiers thought that it was the second prince who had decided to take advantage of this opportunity to attack the crown prince. As for the latter judgment, all of the common people seemed to think this way. The attack of all of the Dingzhou soldiers finally succeeded in overcoming the most important problem of military morale among all the defections. Confident, they began to attack the Qin family as a matter of course. Of course, such a hurried defection would not be able to demonstrate the true power of the Dingzhou army. Fortunately, the Qin family still had a large number of soldiers. However, the old Qin master had suddenly died, Qin Heng had been stabbed to death by Jing Ji's spear, and a few generals had escorted the crown prince to the back of the camp. Of the 8 generals on the front lines, 5 had been killed and 3 wounded. It could truly be said that they were a group of dragons without a leader. For an army with slightly more stable morale to attack an army without a leader to command them, victory or defeat was not difficult to predict. On the chaotic battlefield, other than the Dingzhou army, not many people heard the military orders of the Yi family generals. There were still many people fighting with all their might. Even if it wasn't to kill the enemy, it was to protect their own lives. Covered in blood, the great prince brandished the long knife in his hand and opened a bloody path. Although he was unable to charge into the rebel army's camp, he successfully met up with the remaining Black Knights. In the fierce battle, he did not see the scene of Fan Xian, Yizhong, and Gong Dian attacking at the same time. He thought he had reached the end of his road. Fresh blood dripped from his hand, but his expression was solemn. As a prince of the Qin kingdom, he had fought for the royal palace until now without a glimmer of regret in the depths of his heart. A thunderous sound of horse hooves rang out. The Dingzhou cavalry, which had been resting, finally charged over. The great prince narrowed his eyes slightly and glanced at the already exhausted Jinggu. Tightening the knife hilt in his hand, he was about to chop down. However, the Dingzhou cavalry swept past in front of them and did not attack at all. Instead, they charged ruthlessly toward the Qin family army. Kill. Chapter 572. The sound of killing shook the sky. Suddenly and without any warning, countless riders covered in Dingzhou dust began to attack the Qin family from all directions in the square. A group of about 1,000 cavalrymen, like a sickle, sharply swept across the royal palace. The scaling ladders that towered up to the top of the royal palace were, in a flash, like ripe grains in a paddy field. With a crash, they were neatly cut off at the root. The ears of wheat were always heavy. There were a number of rebel soldiers bravely climbing up the scaling ladders. They had no idea that friendly soldiers would attack them from below. The defenses at the bottom of the scaling ladders had not considered this problem. So many three-part scaling ladders collapsed miserably from the two sides toward the center. The rebel soldiers on them cried out wretchedly as they fell from high above like grains falling from a harvest. Many people fell to their deaths on the ground, spilling out blood and internal organs. They were then pressed to the bottom by the layers of scaling ladders that randomly fell to the ground like rice stalks. The rebel soldiers who had already reached the palace walls suddenly felt something strange behind them and couldn't help but feel shocked. On the contrary, the remaining Imperial Army and Overwatch Council subordinates in the palace walls discovered that the situation on the battlefield below had suddenly changed and found their last chance of survival. Courage immediately surged into their chests. The people defending the royal palace charged forward and surrounded the rebel soldiers who had reached the palace walls, forcing the Qin family soldiers, who no longer had a path of retreat, into a hopeless situation. There were already rebel soldiers breaking through the front doors of the royal palace and carrying out a sudden attack. They had no idea what was happening behind them. The Yi family's two groups of riders approached from the west in Taiping Square. After sweeping through the scaling ladders, they did not slow down at all. They rode directly into the pitch-black front doors of the royal palace and launched an attack behind the rebel soldiers entering the palace. On the square, the Dingzhou army, which had taken an advantageous position, had long begun their counterattack against the Qin family. Too many of the Qin family's upper-level generals had died or been injured. Additionally, the incident had happened suddenly. For a moment, they were unable to organize an effective defense or counterattack. On the battlefield, what decided victory or defeat was often the moment the battle began. The generals of the Dingzhou army carried out the secret order the commander had given them before they entered the city. With a thunderous force, they attacked and caught the Qin family's army unprepared. For a moment, the rebel soldiers suffered heavy casualties. The scales of victory and defeat had already tipped toward the Dingzhou army. As for why the scales were tipped, that was something that not everyone could understand. This was especially so for the Imperial Army and Shadow Cavalry in the center of the square. They had already gone through 4 hours of desperate fighting and were extremely exhausted. Seeing that they were about to face death, their eyes were wide open and they were clearly at a loss. The great prince, covered in blood, stood together with Jinggu, who had his head lowered. They looked in shock at the murderous cries around them, the black smoke, the light of the knife, and the shadow of the sword. They listened to the grunts, wretched wails, and sorrowful cries in the square. They discovered that the long knife in their hands was actually very heavy. the rebel army suddenly began to attack each other. The Qin family was unable to protect themselves, and the Dingzhou army purposely avoided the area in the middle of the square. The great prince and the people protecting the royal palace stood in a daze on the empty ground, not understanding what had happened. A moment ago, they were still fighting with their lives on the line. In the next moment, they seemed to have become pure spectators. What happened in Jingdo seemed to have nothing to do with them. The great prince glanced at the wounded Jinggu at his side and furrowed his brows. As the commander of the Western Expedition Army, he knew how important one's reaction on the battlefield was. Regardless of what problems were happening within the rebel army, if he wanted to use this opportunity, he had to immediately give the order to gather the nearly 2,000 remaining effective forces inside and outside the palace. However, there was a loss in his eyes because the inside and outside of the palace had already been divided into a number of battle zones. It was impossible for the imperial army to band together. Furthermore, from the bottom of his heart, the great prince did not want these exhausted subordinates to once again leave this rare moment of safety and throw themselves into the flames of battle. Thus, he had to see clearly what the Dingzhou army's sudden betrayal meant. Did the second prince want to use this opportunity to get rid of the crown prince and take the throne himself? But why did the Dingzhou army purposely stay away from the imperial army and work hard to protect the royal palace? He suddenly thought of everything Fan Xian had done since the early hours of the morning. His heart thumped. Did Fan Xian know that the Yi family would make a move? Was that why he had sent out those orders to find a good opportunity for the other party? At this moment, a member of the Imperial Guard rushed to his side and whispered a few words into his ear. He briefly explained what had happened in the rebel army's camp that someone had noticed earlier. The great prince's eyes lit up slightly. He looked at the Dingzhou army shuttling around him, the Qin family troops retreating step by step not far away, and the dragon flag where the crown prince was. He finally relaxed a little. His admiration for Fan Xian grew a little stronger. Urgent military orders rang out from all around them. Amidst the dust and smoke filling the air, the powers of all sides gathered and charged. The great prince led the remaining 200 people and the imperial soldiers who had returned from Taiping Square. Fortunately, they met up together and slowly pressed toward the royal palace. In the distance, hidden by the dust and smoke, the bright yellow dragon flag could faintly be seen leaving the square. The entire square had become a battlefield of carnage. Although the Qin family's rebel army had suffered heavy casualties, they had more people than the Dingzhou army. Although the military orders did not go their way, they still made the Dingzhou army pay a great price by relying on the Qing army's naturally outstanding individual soldier qualities. The scene was chaotic. All of the Qing soldiers had become countless small battle groups and were fighting together. This situation had arisen because, at the very beginning, the Dingzhou army had received the crown prince's edict and was prepared to change formations with the Qin family. This created the chaos. Along the line of the royal palace, there were battles happening on all sides. People were dying everywhere, and there were wretched cries everywhere. The autumn sun hung high in the sky and finally pierced through the smoke around the royal palace, illuminating everything clearly. Blood flowed all over the ground, particularly where there was a moat on 3 sides of the royal palace. The blood had already seeped into the river. Many of the dead and wounded soldiers also fell miserably into the river. Some of the rebel soldiers who had not completely died were soaked in the cold moat water and woke up. However, they were powerless to struggle ashore. Wretchedly and powerlessly, they sank into the river. It looked like there were countless water ghosts in the moat pulling at their ankles. Faced with the Dingzhou army's sudden attack, the Qin family managed to hold out for a while before finally retreating in defeat. A few generals protected the crown prince and led the group that had gathered back away from the square. Following the streets of Jingdo, they began to retreat toward the city gate guards that the rebel soldiers still controlled. The dragon flag retreated, and the army lost again. The Dingzhou army cried out in unison and charged forward bravely. Immediately, the battlefield once again spread from the 3 li around the royal palace toward Jingdou. Chasing and being chased, killing and being killed, arrows flew wildly, and knives and spears struck out viciously. All of Jingdou began to tremble. They knew that they would face an upheaval and bloodbath that had not been seen in 16 years. Thud, thud, thud. A series of heavy horse hooves cut through the remaining smoke on the ground. With the general on the horse, they appeared in front of the imperial army and black knights below the royal palace in this corner that seemed to have been forgotten by the rebel army. Countless sounds of metal colliding rang out. No one gave an order. There was no need for an order. These exhausted imperial soldiers and black knights, who had suffered heavy casualties, suddenly exploded with spirit. They quickly changed their formation and surrounded the general and the soldiers behind him. The expressions of the soldiers behind the general changed dramatically. They all drew their knives from their sheaths. The great prince slowly walked out. Looking at the familiar figure on the horse, he furrowed his brows and maintained his silence. Yi Zhong slowly raised his right arm. The dozens of soldiers slowly put away their knives with wary expressions. However, they still nervously watched the remaining soldiers who had once given them countless mental blows. Earlier, on the square, these hundreds of riders had charged twice and thrown the rebel army into chaos. Spears pointed at Qin Heng and knives cut through tens of thousands of soldiers. It was truly terrifying. I will move 3,000 soldiers to help your highness defend the city. Yi Zhong looked at the blood-covered great prince in front of him. A glimmer of admiration flashed through his eyes, but his tone remained calm. Gong Dian will arrive immediately. He will help your highness control the situation. The great prince looked at him and still did not speak. Yi Zhong had already reached into his clothes and took out a token. He tossed it toward the great prince from a distance. The great prince raised his aching right arm and caught it. Looking closely, he saw that it was the token that Fan Xian had taken from his subordinate in the early hours of the morning. He involuntarily furrowed his brows. Raising his head to look at Yi Zhong's steady figure on the horse, he asked, "Father." He only said 2 words before Yi Zhong interrupted him. He knew what the great prince wanted to ask, but he had no idea how to answer. There were no idiots in the royal family. When Yi Zhong revealed his identity and had Fan Xian's token as a keepsake, the great prince was already certain of Yi Zhong's role in this rebellion. He also knew that a figure of Yi Zhong's level was not someone that Fan Xian could persuade. It could only be said that before his father left the capital, he had already made arrangements for the Dingzhou soldiers who had pretended to come forward to offer up prisoners of war. The great prince took a deep breath and didn't say anything more. He directly gave the order, "Give chase." He knew that Yi Zhong was waiting for his order. Although the Qin family had already been defeated and the sounds of killing still lingered in the square, the Yi family's Dingzhou army had, in reality, already controlled the entire situation in Jingdou. Yet, Yi Zhong still wanted to see him. He needed him, the commander of the imperial army, the eldest son of the royal family, to give Yi Zhong an order. Given the current situation, the power in his hands already allowed Yi Zhong to control Jingdou. However, he didn't want and didn't dare let anyone have this kind of speculation after the fact, so he was particularly respectful toward the great prince. The flames of war had already spread into Jingdou. Unavoidably, it affected the commoners who had closed their doors for a day and night. There were tragic battles happening everywhere. The Dingzhou cavalry had already chased after the Qin family's main camp toward the 9 city gates of Jingdou. However, the crown prince was not below the dragon flag. This young man, who was about to break into the royal palace and become the new monarch of the Qin kingdom, had suddenly been struck across the waist. His dream had been shattered in front of his eyes. His expression had long become ghastly. Fortunately, the Qin family's loyal generals reacted quickly and led the remaining soldiers to carve out a bloody path. Li Qingqian didn't want to retreat because he knew that he only had the Qin family's army in his hands. If he left Jingdou, although the world was large, where would he find shelter? Probably even his aunt had not thought that the Yi family would betray him. A bitter smile rose to the corners of the young crown prince's lips. The jolting of the warhorse beneath him did not cause his frozen expression to change at all. Earlier, he had been thinking about how to win the Yi family over from the side of the second prince after he ascended the throne and become a true emperor. He was also thinking about how to resist the pressure of his aunt, mother, grandmother, and old Qin master and pardon the civil officials on the city walls who were determined to oppose him, particularly the scholars Xu and Hu. Who would have thought that the Yi family would betray him like this? His aunt probably still didn't know this shocking news. His mother and grandmother were still trapped on the city walls, and the old Qin master was already dead. The crown prince felt a sharp pain in his chest. He almost couldn't stand straight on his horse. At his side, a rebel general said with tears in his eyes, "Your Highness, as long as we get out of the city and gather soldiers, Shao Mountain, and our people, we can charge straight north and meet up with Governor Yan. The matter will definitely succeed." These words were reasonable, but Li Qingqian didn't really believe it. Fan Xian had returned alive, Governor Yan was probably also dead. Since the Yi family had betrayed, great-uncle Lu Yun was probably. Li Qingqian sighed in his heart. Following the horse toward the city gates, he didn't know what kind of waves were surging in his heart. Below the city walls, one of the main conspirators of the rebellion, the second prince, was looking at his father-in-law with a venomous and hopeless gaze. Before Yi Zhong personally led the Dingzhou army in pursuit, for some reason, he had returned to his camp and glanced at his son-in-law. "If you want to live, you have to remember everything the Dingzhou army said today." The second prince's entire body was restrained. He stood wretchedly under his horse. He raised his head and looked fiercely at Yi Zhong as he spat. He knew what Yi Zhong's words meant. The Dingzhou army's final betrayal was nominally because he wanted to avenge his father and carry out his father's posthumous edict. However, he knew that was not the case. Of all the people involved, the one who felt the most hopeless, shocked, and angry was the second prince. He had no idea that on Dong Mountain, the Qing emperor had specifically said to Fan Xian that if possible, he should leave the second prince alive. At such a moment, the second prince had never thought he could survive. What made him most angry was that he seemed to have planned for a long time. In the end, he was the stupidest person. Everything that he had done now seemed so ridiculous, so comical. His eyes were filled with anger. His usually gentle expression appeared particularly dark and cold. "Father-in-law, you are truly a good dog. However, if father truly dies, what will you do?" Yi Zhong didn't say anything. He slowly turned his horse around. The expression on his face became somewhat dim. Behind him, the second prince yelled, "You bunch of liars." At this moment, a heavy object suddenly fell from above the royal palace walls and struck viciously against the hard stone tiles with a muffled thud. The person who fell was wearing beautiful and luxurious clothing. Having suffered such a heavy blow, all the bones in her body were broken. Blood flowed freely. She had long died. However, her head was perfectly preserved, revealing a dignified and haggard face filled with despair and madness. Chapter 573. Writing the first few chapters was too exhausting. These 2 days have made me tired. I need to take a break. Looking at the Empress body on the ground and the pool of flesh and blood, everyone was shocked speechless. Yi Zhong said a few words in a low voice. He then turned his horse around and began to chase toward the city gate. The Qin family's strength was still very powerful. He had to quickly communicate with the soldiers in all directions and attack to the end. Secondly, the Empress had died in front of him. For his own safety, it was best to hide as far away as possible. It was best to leave the matters of the royal family to the great prince and the Duke of Donghua to handle. The Empress' suicide as she fell from the city gate was outside of many people's expectations. Although the Crown Prince's army had been defeated and the Empress' fate would not be good, no one had thought that the outwardly gentle but inwardly useless Empress would, in the last moment of her life, summon such courage. At this time, the killing on the palace walls had not ended. The Qin family's rebel army was still stubbornly resisting. Fan Xian and the great prince's trusted subordinates were concerned about the Empress Dowager and officials' safety. They also did not ignore the Empress' existence. However, they did not have the extra energy to guard against the mournful leap. The Empress jumped down and died in front of tens of thousands of people. This scene was shocking to the core. The second prince stared at the Empress' body in a daze like an idiot. Suddenly, he began to tremble from the tips of his toes to the top of his head. His entire body was enveloped by coldness as he trembled endlessly. He didn't know what kind of end he was about to face. Unconsciously, he raised his head and looked. After confirming that his birth mother, Lady Shu, was safe, he collapsed to the ground. At his side, Dingzhou's soldiers had already helped him up. Respectfully and warily, they surrounded him in the center, terrified that something would happen to him. The second prince's face was expressionless, but his gaze was unfocused. He thought to himself, things have already gotten to this point. If someone wants to die, who can stop them? The Qin family's army had already retreated. The Dingzhou army continued to give chase. Jingdou was filled with the sounds of killing, particularly the group of rebel soldiers with the dragon flag. They moved with extraordinary speed through the long streets, passed by Jingyang Gate, which Zhang Deqing personally guarded, and sped out of Jingdou. Zhang Deqing's face was ashen as he watched the scene in front of him. He didn't know what he was feeling. Loyalty was a belief that needed to be upheld for a lifetime. Even if it wavered at the last moment, the loyalty of the first half of his life would become a foundation for treachery. He knew he had no chance to turn things around. He also didn't have the courage to use the 3,000 soldiers of the City Gate Department and the 9 city gates to help the Qin family slow the Dingzhou army. The city gates could only guard against the people outside the city. How could they guard against the people inside? Zhang Deqing let out a long, gloomy sigh. He took one last look at Jingyang Gate, which seemed to flash with a golden light under the blazing sunlight. He led his personal guards, followed the dragon flag, and followed the rebel army as they began to flee. Jingyang Gate didn't even have time to close when the Dingzhou army led by Gong Dian charged over. Turning into a yellow dragon, they gave chase. The fleeing crown prince used the dragon flag as a smokescreen. He was surrounded and protected by the few remaining generals of the Qin family as he arrived at Donghua Gate. The old Qin master and Qin Heng were both dead. At this moment, the rebel army was like a group of dragons without a leader. Fortunately, the family generals the old Qin master had sent to protect the crown prince were still alive. At such a critical moment, they had thought of this escape method. They intended to leave the capital and head north to meet up with the northern expedition camp in Sangzhou. However, the crown prince's heart had long become dim. Since there was foreshadowing in the capital, perhaps Governor Yan was already dead. Where could he escape to? He still didn't know that his mother had fallen to the city walls and died. He took a deep breath and forcefully raised his spirits a moment later. He thought to himself that if his father had truly died, with his aunt's help, he might be able to rise again. After all, he was the crown prince. The world was named Li and not Fan. Even if he controlled Jingdou, he might not be able to control the world. However, the glimmer of fighting spirit that he had raised with great difficulty was instantly shattered by the two tightly shut city gates in front of him. The crown prince and the generals looked with ashen faces at the city gate guards waiting with arrows on the stone steps on either side of Donghua Gate. They looked at the white-clothed official beside the general and their hearts tightened. The crown prince recognized the white-clothed official. He knew that he was the third-ranking figure in the Overwatch Council, Yan Bingyun, whom his father greatly admired. However, he had already received news that when he was trying to convince Zhang Diqing, he had already been taken down by his aunt's people and rescued by someone else. How had he come here? Crown Prince, please wait. Yan Bingyun's white robes were still stained with blood from Ling Chen's fatal attack. He coughed with a serious expression. After the black-clothed man who had saved his life placed him in a safe area, he had disappeared without a trace. No one knew where he had gone. Yan Bingyun was unable to personally participate in the events that happened in Jingdo during this half a day. Through one of the remaining channels, he watched everything nervously. When there was a strange movement in the square, he had already arrived at Donghua Gate. No Yamen was united. Even if Zhang Diqing had been the commander of the city gate guards for 20 years, it was impossible for him to command all of his subordinates to be of the same mind in today's situation, especially when the rebel army had been defeated. Yan Bingyun knew he was taking a risk, but he liked the feeling of taking risks. Furthermore, he felt that after making a big mistake, he had to make up for something and do something for Sir Fan Jr. Fortunately, he succeeded this time. The city gate guard successfully blocked the crown prince at Donghua Gate. The emperor's strict control over the city gate guards made the commander of Donghua Gate stand firmly by Fan Xian's side after learning the specific situation. Perhaps, he stood on the side of his own glory, splendor, and wealth. If the crown prince was allowed to lead his troops out of Jingdo and contact the soldiers in the wilderness, who knew what changes would happen in the future? The rebel army wholeheartedly wanted to break out of the city and did not give Yan Bingyun much time to negotiate. Without asking the crown prince, the generals of the Qin family began to prepare for battle. Hearing a military order, the rebel army bravely charged toward Donghua Gate. Arrows flew in unison from both sides, and there were heavy casualties. Not long after the battle began, the crown prince's face paled. He heard a thunderous roar coming from behind him. It was the Dingzhou cavalry. A flag fluttered in the wind in the streets of Jingdo and quickly approached Donghua Gate. There was a large Yi written on the flag. Yi Zhong had personally led the troops here. To his surprise, he found that Donghua Gate was already closed. The rebel army the crown prince was in was blocked in front of the not-so-wide city gate. Densely packed, they took up half the main street. He took a deep breath. He knew that Donghua Gate could not be held for much longer. Raising his right arm, he prepared to carry out the bloodiest part of the Jingdo incident. He had not expected that the rebel army's violent attack on Donghua Gate would gradually slow. After Yi Zhong caught up, the crown prince's head had been lowered the entire time, resting on his chest. No one knew what he was thinking. Then, he slowly raised his head. His eyes were filled with a dimness and relief. He opened his mouth and said, "Surrender." Everyone fell silent. They looked at the crown prince with disbelief, anger, grief, hopelessness, and confusion. They didn't know why he had suddenly lost all will to fight. The crown prince's gaze slowly swept across the faces of the generals and soldiers who followed him loyally. He knew that if he fought to the death, it was not impossible for him to kill his way out of the city. However, this matter had progressed to this point. The crown prince was tired, and hopeless. So what if he killed his way out of the city? From Jingdo to Cangzhou was thousands of li away. Was he going to let these thousands of soldiers die one by one in this endless pursuit? Was he going to let the army fight, kill, and set fire to the fertile land of the Qing people? The crown prince turned his horse's head and looked at Yi Zhong in the distance through the forest of spears that filled the street. General Yi, I don't want to leave. Yi Zhong furrowed his brows slightly. He didn't understand why the scene in front of him had occurred. No matter what, he would never have guessed the change in the crown prince's mentality. He always thought the crown prince had other thoughts. Since the crown prince had spoken, it seemed that there was a chance. Yi Zhong didn't want his Dingzhou army to pay even more casualties. Your Highness is wise. Li Qingqian's position as crown prince had already been stripped by Fan Xian in the palace. However, Yi Zhong still said it out of habit. Li Qingqian laughed bitterly and then said, I have a condition. Please speak, crown prince. I want to see Fan Xian. He must promise me one thing. Li Qingqian's face immediately became cold. It wasn't because he understood something. As a son of the Li family, as the crown prince who had been raised as the next ruler for many years, he faintly guessed what kind of fate the hand in the sky wanted to mold in Jingdou. He didn't want to submit to that fate. At the very least, he wanted the hand to be hit by some small pebbles when it was molding clay figurines. Yi Zhong was silent for a moment. He then said, I don't know where Duke Fan is right now. A strange light flashed through Li Qingqian's eyes. He immediately guessed something. His expression became ugly. He began to worry about the safety of certain people. He thought to himself that his condition had not yet fallen into Fan Xian's ears. Would it be too late? Yi Zhong was lying because he could guess where Fan Xian was. In Jingdou, which had basically become a sea of blood, regardless of whether it was the rebel soldiers or the people who had accepted Fan Xian's power as regent, they had all lost track of him. Ever since the old Qin master was assassinated, Duke Fan, who was in charge of Jingdou's affairs, could no longer be found. The crown prince, who had made up his mind in front of Donghua Gate, guessed Fan Xian's whereabouts at the first instant. Yi Zhong was able to guess it because he had personally told Fan Xian the address. The crown prince was able to guess it because he cared deeply about everything there and the people there. Fan Xian was in Taiping Courtyard. Dressed in black, he stood on one side of Lujing River and looked at the scenery on the other side. His entire person merged into the shadows of the trees. If one didn't look carefully, it was impossible to see him. This was already the outskirts of Jingdou. After he killed Qin Yi, he had used his fastest speed to take advantage of the chaos in Jingdou to cross the tall city walls and come here. In this royal courtyard were his wife, Lin Wan, who he cared about the most, De Bao, and the eldest princess, who had single-handedly planned the Dong Mountain incident and the Jingdou rebellion. Fan Xian was not unfamiliar with Taiping Courtyard. More accurately, he was extremely familiar with it. This manor had been his family's property 20 years ago. It was where his mother, Yi Qingmei, had lived after coming to the Qin kingdom. After the Yi family was destroyed, this manor had been taken back by the royal family. However, the emperor had always sealed up Taiping Courtyard and used internal guards to watch it, forbidding any member of the royal family from entering. Only then did its reputation gradually disappear. During the summer and autumn of the 4th year of the Qin calendar, Fan Xian had once taken his sister to look across the river. At that time, the river wind caressed their bodies, making them sigh. Fan Xian didn't understand why the eldest princess would choose Taiping Courtyard as her residence for directing Jingdou matters. At this moment, he had no time to think about this. How to safely rescue Wan and De Bao was the most important thing. Although Wan was the eldest princess' own daughter, Fan Xian could not guarantee that after personally seeing so many years of planning come to such a tragic end, that crazy woman wouldn't become unrecognizable to her own family. During these 10 days, he had always known what kind of situation Wan was in, but he still had no way to solve it. He also did not reveal a glimmer of worry in front of others. Only he knew how Wan and Dabao's safety affected his emotions. Standing on this side of the river and looking at the other side, Fan Xian's heart throbbed slightly. Only now did he understand that Wan was more important in his heart than he had imagined. Wu Zhu had once personally told him about the layout of the rooms in Taiping Courtyard. Furthermore, Wu Zhu had once gone deep into the courtyard to retrieve something. After Fan Xian came to the other side of the courtyard, he carefully examined the defenses of the quiet and secluded courtyard. It was much weaker than he had imagined. It looked like the Overwatch Council and his ceaseless attacks on Xinyang these years had indeed had some effect. The aces by the eldest princess side had been greatly reduced. While the sounds of killing shook the heavens in Jingdou, the Taiping courtyard on the outskirts of the capital was completely silent. This sharp contrast made it so that Fan Xian did not dare to move lightly. When Taiping courtyard was first built, its location was special. It was actually built on a small peninsula in the middle of Lujing River. There was only one passageway into the courtyard. The surrounding riverbanks were all relatively lower and shallower. Fan Xian observed for a long time from the treetops and branches. He found that his line of sight was blocked by the courtyard walls. It was impossible to see the situation inside. The design of the courtyard walls was very clever. It was not very high, but it just so happened to block all the lines of sight from the outside. Fan Xian's lips tasted bitter. He knew that even if he brought in a sniper rifle, it would not be of much use. Thinking of this, his heart couldn't help but thump. He thought to himself, when my mother designed this courtyard, did she ever think of defending against a sniper rifle? However, there was no courtyard in the world that could not be attacked. Otherwise, the Yi girl would not have disappeared from the Qin kingdom 20 years ago. Fan Xian was just a bit afraid of harming the innocent. He didn't attack forcefully because he knew that Li Yunrui's move had indeed caught him where it hurt. He didn't think for long on this side of the river. Fan Xian's expression calmed. Taking a deep breath, he turned toward a bridge in the bamboo that he had once passed. Like he was taking a stroll, he walked to the front door of Taiping Courtyard. Behind the bamboo forest on the wall, many people suddenly appeared and surrounded Fan Xian in the center. These were the eldest princess' personal guards. They looked at him with faces full of shock. They had long recognized his identity and didn't understand why he would appear like this at such a time. Chapter 574. Fan Xian stood at the door of Taiping Courtyard and looked sideways at the faint green in the courtyard. After he said those words, he didn't say another word. A dozen aces from Xinyang looked at him with faces full of astonishment. They didn't know what had happened in Jingdou. How could this commissioner of the Overwatch Council, who should have been trapped in the royal palace, suddenly appear in front of Taiping Courtyard's door? A gust of wind blew through the bamboo forest, calmly and faintly removing some of the heat around them. The Xinyang aces gave a low cry and charged toward Fan Xian. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and retreated. His left arm seemed to be able to twist and strike out. His fist, which had reached its limit, suddenly opened. Like an old tree opening its leaves, it slapped the side of an ace's face with a slap. Although it didn't land, it still made half of the ace's teeth fall out. Fresh blood flowed as he fell to the ground and fainted. Fan Xian stood on the tips of his toes. The tyrannical Jinqi in his body surged out. His entire body shrunk. Like a faint shadow, he charged backward out of the encirclement. Looking at the people who gritted their teeth and charged over, his eyes became even more bloodshot. His hands trembled slightly. Just as he had said to Sir Yen Jr. when he first set the time, the present Jingdou was basically an empty city for Fan Xian. The most powerful figures in the world that could threaten him had all been attracted to Dong Mountain by the emperor. Regardless of whether it was the Northern Chi Aces or the numbing 9th-level swordsman in Dongi, they were all attracted by that jade-like mountain like a magnet. There were only 3 9th-level Aces in Jingdo. The old Qin master was already dead, and Yi Zhong was on his side. Fan Xian had confidence that as long as he didn't sink into a chaotic army, who could kill him? However, he had no way of knowing Wan and Dabao's whereabouts, so he didn't attack forcefully. Thus, he gambled again and came outside Taiping Courtyard to knock on the door. Perhaps this was a bit arrogant, but it was actually a kind of helplessness. Faced with the eldest princess's methods, even someone as dark and ruthless as Fan Xian could only temporarily shed his tyrannical nature and find another way. However, these Xinyang Aces did not know that Sir Fan Jr. was preparing to attack with words. Amidst their shock, they attacked with all their strength. In just one exchange, someone was heavily injured. No one knew what kind of bloody battle would follow. The Aces charging toward Fan Xian suddenly stopped their steps. The crossbows sticking out of the walls of Taiping Courtyard also raised their arrowheads and no longer pointed at Fan Xian. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at the crossbow bolts. He couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. However, there were always too many helpless things in life. If he wanted Wan and Dabao to be safe, he could only lean toward the Tiger Mountain in front of him. No one stopped Fan Xian from entering the courtyard again. Countless eyes watched his every move, whether openly or secretly. If he reacted in the slightest, the real attack would probably begin. Because at this time, from the Taiping Courtyard came an extremely elegant and faint sound of a zither. The sound was like the gurgling of flowing water, calming one's heart and mind, causing those who heard it to feel uneasy and at ease. Since the princess had already given the order through the sound of the guqin, the Aces throughout Taiping Courtyard would no longer stop Fan Xian from entering. However, they had endless questions in their hearts. Why did the princess want Fan Xian to enter? Did she not know how terrifying Fan Xian was? Why didn't she take advantage of the fact that Fan Xian had come alone to kill him in one blow? A dozen people slowly escorted or watched Fan Xian into the front door of Taiping Courtyard. They then stopped in front of the second bridge. In front of them was a forbidden area. Without the eldest princess's personal order, no one was allowed to enter. Fan Xian stood in front of the bridge and lowered his head to look at the wooden planks on the bridge. There were gaps between the planks through which he could see the clear river water below. The section of Lujing River in Taiping Courtyard was separated by a stone path to the island. It formed a pool of slow water like a level lake. The surface of the water seemed to be forever still and would not flow. The quiet and peaceful sound of the zither came from the inner courtyard across the bridge and gently entered his ears. He lowered his head to look at the flowing water and tilted his ear to listen to the sound of the zither. It was as if he wanted to judge the current state of mind of the player. A moment later, he carefully tidied his clothes and stepped onto the bridge. Walking steadily to the island, he pushed open the wooden door to the inner courtyard and raised his eyes to look calmly at the woman gently stroking the strings of the zither under the pavilion by the lake in the center of the island. Raising his hands, he bowed respectfully and said, "Greetings, Your Highness." The sound of the zither did not stop at all because of this sudden greeting. That pair of slender fingers and white wrists plucked and stroked on the zither. It was still very steady. Li Yunrui lowered her head slightly. It was as if she was putting all of her attention on the 7 strings of the zither in front of her. However, her wrist lowered slightly. Her fingertips slid to the right end. Compared to the quiet sound earlier, the sound of the zither seemed even more reserved and elegant. The little lake in the center of the island was rippled by the autumn wind. The stones by the lake were green and contrasted beautifully with the short, shallow hill around them. There was a pavilion on the hill, but the person and the zither were not in the pavilion. Instead, they were under a flowering tree. The stamens of the flowers on the tree were a faint pink. No one knew what they were called. The autumn wind ruffled the green pond and brushed against the tops of the flowering trees. The water moved and petals fell like rain. They landed on the eldest princess' wide-sleeved ancient robes like a slightly darker flower shadow. Fan Xian looked quietly in that direction. He looked at Li Yunrui's calm and indifferent face that still could not hide its charm. Today, the eldest princess had not put on grand makeup. She had only slightly raised the tips of her brows, but her natural and romantic aura filled the entire garden. A head of beautiful black hair fell behind her shoulders. She had only used a silk handkerchief to pull it up behind her head. It made her appear even more elegant and at ease. She was playing the zither with her head lowered. Her eyelids were slightly lowered. Her long eyelashes gently rested on her jade-like skin. It made Fan Xian involuntarily think of the pair of eyes his wife had inherited from her. If one didn't know who she was and didn't purposely think of her age, then any man would have to admit this woman's charm. Fan Xian walked along the green stones by the lakeside. He narrowed his eyes slightly in the sound of the zither. He then opened his mouth and said, "Yan Xiaoyi is dead." The sound of the zither continued to hum softly. Occasionally, it would rise and make a few vibrating sounds to show that she had long known of this matter and didn't need to say more. "Qin Heng is dead," Fan Xian said quietly as he stared at her hands. 2 fingers of Li Yunrui's right hand slid across the 4th string and pressed it a few times. The zither under her fingers made a leisurely sound. Fan Xian didn't hesitate for a moment. His plain and powerful words pressed forward. "Qin Yi is also dead." Li Yunrui still did not raise her head. The speed at which the 7 strings of the zither moved became slower and slower. It gradually became more sorrowful. However, the zither was elegant and light. It was sorrowful but not hurtful. The light thoughts of separation could be seen clearly. However, in the slight trembling of the wide sleeves behind her hands, it was faintly possible to capture the eldest princess's emotions. Suddenly, the sound of the zither rose again. However, the sound of the zither had always been deep and elegant. No matter how fast the fingers moved, the range of the sound was always limited within that range. The playing, which should have been filled with hostility, used a slowness that was completely different from the speed to declare Yongjing's sense of purity. Only those who were confident could play the correct sound. Fan Xian had already walked under the flowering trees and to her side. He lowered his head to look at the undulating strings like waves. Suddenly, he said, "People call me a scholar, but I actually know nothing about music. I'm afraid the thoughts you used, for me, are like playing the lute to a cow." Li Yunrui had probably never heard of playing the lute to a cow. She continued to lower her head and stroke the strings, intoxicated and unconcerned. She didn't know who she was playing this song to. It just so happened that Fan Xian had come to Taiping at this time. Fan Xian was thick-skinned and never knew what bashfulness was. Seeing that she was ignoring him, he smiled self-mockingly and sat down beside the eldest princess. He then looked at the side of her face and said very naturally, "Yi Zhong has betrayed us." The sound of the zither suddenly became chaotic. With a muffled hum, it rose in spirals and spread through the green hills and flowering trees by the lake. The zither struggled, and 3 of them broke. The eldest princess slowly raised her head and looked into Fan Xian's eyes. It only took a moment for her to recover her calm emotions. She said, "Every time I see you, it seems that I don't hear any good news." Although the eldest princess and Fan Xian had stood on their own sides and endlessly fought and clashed, their struggle ran through the major events of the Qin court these few years. Strangely enough, Fan Xian and she had only seen each other a few times. This pair had become each other's greatest enemies, but they were actually not very familiar with each other. If you want to hear good news, then following the good news should be my head, Fan Xian said quietly to the eldest princess. Fan Xian spoke quietly to the eldest princess. His gaze casually swept around. Unfortunately, he did not discover anything. His gaze dimmed slightly for a moment. At this time, the eldest princess's hands were quietly stroking the broken strings of the zither. Her eyes were slightly closed, and her originally extremely pale complexion seemed even whiter at this moment, even becoming transparent. The usual alluring blush was nowhere to be seen. Fan Xian's sudden appearance in Taiping Courtyard was indeed beyond her expectations. This was because Fan Xian had moved too quickly. The people she had left in the rebel army had not had time to report the specific situation in Jingdou. She had already faintly sensed that something was wrong, so she didn't attack Fan Xian at the first opportunity. Instead, she had him come in and see how the latter half of the story happened. Furthermore, she held Fan Xian's life in her hands, so she didn't care at all what kind of extraordinary abilities this son-in-law had. However, Fan Xian's 4 consecutive facts made the eldest princess's state of mind finally relax. Although she had guessed Yan Xiaoyi's death long after Fan Xian had appeared in Jingdou, she couldn't help but feel slightly gloomy now that she had personally confirmed it. After all, this governor had always been her trusted aide. She had raised him single-handedly and was loyal to her. Qin Heng and Qin Ye's deaths also made the eldest princess's heart palpitate. She had not thought that the situation in Jingdou would develop like this. Fan Xian's last sentence revealed all the answers and finally made her angry. After only being angry for a moment, the eldest princess had already calmed down. She opened her eyes. Her lips exhaled like orchids, but there was a faint sorrow. Yet, you still came to beg me. Since I have come, you can guess what has happened in Jingdou. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and sat naturally by the eldest princess's side. He and the eldest princess knew each other well. The reason he dared to enter the courtyard alone and the eldest princess let him in was because they each held the other's life in their hands. Neither wanted to, at the first opportunity, cut off all possibilities. The eldest princess had captured Wan and Dabao, and Fan Xian had already obtained an irreversible advantage in Jingdou. Li Yunrui suddenly lowered her head. Her wide sleeves covered the broken string zither. Her light-colored clothing trembled slightly under the movement of her shoulders. She appeared very pitiful. I have come to beg you, Fan Xian said sincerely. Let it go. Hearing the words, let it go, Li Yunrui suddenly raised her head and looked at Fan Xian with an indifferent gaze. She didn't say a word. Although her gaze was indifferent, Fan Xian saw a bone-deep resentment in it. However, this resentment was clearly not directed at him. Instead, it was directed at someone who had seen through him and was directed at someone who was not present. Let it go. What right do you have to say these words to me? Li Yunrui smiled slightly mockingly and picked up a faint flower petal from her shoulder. For Yi Zhong to betray, this has indeed exceeded my expectations. However, since you have come, what do I have to worry about? Perhaps many people are afraid of your martial power, your brain, and the Overwatch Council. But, from the beginning, only I have never worried about your existence. Fan Xian was silent. Everyone thinks that under your glamorous appearance, you are ruthless. The eldest princess looked at him with slight mockery. It has to be said, your disguise in the Overwatch Council these years has been very good. You made people think that at a critical juncture of great interest, you could transform into a person who would not recognize family. But, I know that you were never like that. So, you captured Wan and Dabao and did not let them go for even a moment. Fan Xian cut off her words. 2 years ago, I said that you appear powerful, but in reality, you cannot withstand a single blow, Li Yunrui slowly said. You care about too many people in this world. Your entire body is a lifeline. If I randomly grab one of them, you won't be able to turn things around. Otherwise, why would you not stay in Jingdo right now? Why would you sneak over to me? Fan Xian lowered his head. A moment later, he faintly said, I have to admit, you are very good at reading people. I care about too many people. This makes it very inconvenient for me to do things. Using her as an example, you can use your own daughter's life to threaten your son-in-law, but I cannot. On the contrary, for her's life, I am willing to give up my life. I have suffered like this every night these 10 days. In the end, I still have to admit this. Hearing these words, a faint light rose to the eldest princess' slightly lowered eyelids. Fan Xian gazed calmly at the smooth surface of the lake and the slowly flowing flower petals. Calmly, he said, but being willing to give up my life and being threatened by someone are two different concepts. If her is sick and needs my head to treat her illness, perhaps I will also cut it off. But, if my death is of no benefit to her's safety, why would I do such a thing? He turned his head to look at her and said, I came today to ask you to understand that it is useless to threaten me. Of course, we can talk about how this matter can end well. I care about many people. My entire body is a lifeline. Before the eldest princess opened her mouth, Fan Xian blocked the last opening. But, because there are many lifelines, it is no longer a lifeline. I can't turn around and attack again for her. If that happened, what would happen to my father? What would happen to the eldest and third brothers? They are all family. Naturally, it is impossible to distinguish the importance. Presumably, would agree with my view and actions. The eldest princess couldn't help but smile slightly and shake her head. Fan Xian's words had already blocked off all avenues of her threat. Although she could still try, her thoughts had long floated elsewhere. Faintly, she sighed and said, the eldest and third brothers, it looks like you have finally admitted your identity. The men of the Li family are always so hypocritical and shameless. What good is there in saying so much? It's nothing more than forcing me to make things difficult. Then you can comfort yourself that the deaths of and that idiot have nothing to do with you. You were just forced to do it. Because of family and righteousness, you could only watch without lifting a finger. The one without conscience is me. After the matter is sad, the one comforted by thousands is you. She gazed at Fan Xian's face and smiled slightly. Don't you think you are very shameless? She paused and then said self-mockingly, in this aspect, you are very similar to your father. The father she was talking about was, naturally, the emperor. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, to have the intention to do evil and hide it is shameless. I was forced by you until I had no choice. In the depths of my heart, I don't want anything to happen to The two people's negotiations had reached an impasse. At this moment, Fan Xian could kill the eldest princess at will. However, there was still no trace of and Bao. They were probably being watched by Xinyang aces in some corner. If Fan Xian acted, the first to die would probably be Fan Xian's expression was calm, but he began to worry in the depths of his heart. Faced with such a despairing young woman, he was unable to give her anything she wanted. What should he do next? The eldest princess's expression became serious. It was the complete opposite of her beautiful appearance and peaceful makeup. She gazed dazedly at the surface of the lake and said, I said earlier that the men of the Li family are shameless. It was not wrong. The emperor did not kill me in Guangxin Palace last time because he gave me a chance. On one hand, it was in accordance with his wishes. On the other hand, he could kill me justifiably and not have to worry about how this journey would be described in the history books. She looked at Fan Xian and calmly said, he has never truly cared for me as a sister. Since he confidently gave me this chance, I will certainly give him a great surprise. In Fan Xian's opinion, the emperor's trip to Dong Mountain to worship heaven had indeed taken a great risk. Furthermore, he had completely underestimated the eldest princess's methods. To be able to invite two great grandmasters from a foreign country to move the rebel army to surround the capital, such powerful persuasive and organizational skills, and such a large plan were truly difficult to imagine that such a weak woman could shoulder it alone. However, Yi Zhong's strike also made Fan Xian understand one thing. The eldest princess had laid out a large plan, but the emperor had laid out an even larger plan. The only people who could completely destroy the eldest princess were her brother or that strange old cripple in this matter. "And Ji, I want to ask you a question," the eldest princess suddenly said. "In the past, I have also tried to repair our relationship, but why have you always pulled your hands behind your back?" Before Fan Xian could reply, Li Yunrui spoke first and lightly. "Don't say it's because I once tried to kill you or because some of your trusted aides died at my hands. You and I both know what kind of person you are. Perhaps you are loyal to your family and friends, but it doesn't mean you are a hot-blooded man." Fan Xian was silent. A moment later, he said, "So, it's very simple. You won't retreat, and the emperor will not accept us becoming close." In reality, he didn't want to talk about the past with the eldest princess. However, the eldest princess had strangled his lifeline, so he could only feign civility. However, the eldest princess did not seem to be looking back at the past at a loss after her grand plan had failed. Fan Xian's heart jumped. He stared into the eldest princess's eyes. She lowered her head slightly and said, "Don't misunderstand. I have no desire to join hands with you again. Regardless of whether Brother Emperor lives or dies, I don't have much interest in this world." Fan Xian suddenly realized that her expression was very bleak. "Brother is indeed still the most powerful person in the world," Li Yunrui suddenly smiled slightly. "I made a big mistake. I thought he only wanted to use the Dong Mountain heaven worship to draw out Uncle Luyun to kill him. I didn't expect him to have such a powerful ambition. It looks like these dozen years of keeping a low profile and enduring has made it difficult for him to endure the loneliness." Fan Xian's entry into the garden brought her endless grievous news. Given the eldest princess's genius at scheming, she guessed the truth of Dong Mountain in the shortest amount of time. She guessed the emperor's intentions and understood why she hadn't received any news from Dong Mountain Road in 5 days. Don't think that just because news from Dong Mountain Road has been sealed, it means that Brother Emperor is still alive, the eldest princess closed her eyes slightly and faintly said. "That old cripple can also do this. I'm afraid the situation on Dong Mountain is not what you hope for. Since Yi Zhong has taken action, Great Grandmaster Luyun will also take action," Fan Xian said with his head lowered. An expression of seeing through everything rose to the eldest princess's face. Lightly, she said, "Although Sigurd and Ku He believe Yi Luyun is one of my people, how could those two strange creatures so easily believe a person of Qin Kingdom?" Li Yunrui's eyes narrowed, but there was no sense of cold killing intent. There was only indifference and indifference. "You and Brother Emperor seem to have both thought of one thing wrong. After all, I am a person of Qin Kingdom. My entire life has been spent on how to help Brother unify the world. How could I not take into account the dangers that the Qin Kingdom would face in the future when I was about to leave? I have never underestimated Brother. I believe that even in desperate straits, he would still have a miraculous hand to turn the tables. I just didn't think that his miraculous hand would be Uncle Luyun. But, from the beginning, I had never thought of letting Ku He and Sigurd return alive. The 4 great grandmasters will be at Dong Mountain. Even if Uncle Luyun takes action, it will only be a 2-on-2 situation. What kind of people are Ku He and Sigurd? If Brother Emperor wants to kill the two great grandmasters just like this, his thinking is a bit too simple. I trust Brother, so I believe that even if he dies, he will drag the two great grandmasters down with him. Otherwise, how could they be worthy of his intelligence and power? The eldest princess said indifferently. At that time, even if the Qing kingdom has Uncle Lu Yun, Northern Qi and Dongyi will have no one to support them. What is so strange about the current development of the situation? If Uncle Lu Yun takes action and the four great grandmasters are completely destroyed, it is no different from what I think. Strange creatures like great grandmasters should not exist in this world. If there were no great grandmasters, given the military power of the Qing kingdom, we would have long unified the world. Why would we wait until today? No matter what happens on Dong Mountain, it will be of great benefit to the Qing kingdom. The four great grandmasters will go to Dong Mountain. Once they all die, with that kind of momentum, do you think the emperor will be lucky enough to survive? Without allowing Fan Xian to speak, the eldest princess coldly threw out each sentence, making Fan Xian's lips go dry. He didn't know how to respond. He had not thought that from the beginning, the eldest princess had never thought about the great grandmasters on Dong Mountain being able to survive. However, she was not an immortal and couldn't calculate all the details. However, the development of the situation did not seem to be too far from what she had expected. The only variable had appeared in Jingdo. He had left Dong Mountain alive and Yizhong strike. If the four old men die with Brother Emperor, do you think I care? Do you think I care who sits on the throne? Even if you control Jingdo and Qingqian's inability to ascend makes me disappointed, what do these small setbacks count for? The eldest princess glanced at Fan Xian and mockingly said, of the emperor's 5 sons, other than the third prince who is still young, the other 4, even the most useless second prince, can lead the Qing kingdom to conquer the world. Use the 4 great grandmasters to accompany the emperor in death. A proud and crazy glow rose to the eldest princess's face. Presumably, he will be satisfied with having 4 guards like this in the netherworld. If I then gift his son a great world, I can say I have not let him down. What about you? Fan Xian asked in a raspy voice. Only now did he truly understand why his father and Qin Pingping kept saying by his ear that this woman was crazy. Indeed, after creating such a big mess, she didn't care at all who could survive to the end in the battle in Jingdo or sit on the throne. In any case, they were all children of the Li family and the emperor's sons. Me? The eldest princess looked at her son-in-law like she was looking at an idiot and faintly said, the rough soil on the ground or the dazzling shooting star in the world, which one do you want to be? In life, one only needs to release the light that belongs to oneself. Human words are not to be feared, and history books are not to be feared. Someone like Brother Emperor who likes face will, in the end, need my help. Although he knew that he had single-handedly caused the eldest princess and the emperor's final break, Fan Xian still couldn't resist asking in a raspy voice, but, why did you do this? The question was vague, but the eldest princess heard it clearly. Glancing at the quiet and simple scenery of Taiping Courtyard, she slowly said, because he betrayed me. Because I wanted to prove to everyone that a woman can also change the many years of history that these stinky men have dominated. She slowly stood. Flower petals slid down from her body. She looked very beautiful. Fan Xian listened to these words in a daze, particularly the last sentence. He had heard it in Guangxin Palace. It appeared to be ear-piercing and shocking. Li Yunrui used a greedy gaze to glance at the scenery of Taiping Courtyard. In a low voice, she said reluctantly, when I was little, I liked this courtyard, but brother always wouldn't let me come. Later, when I asked father for it, I was scolded by brother. At that time, the mistress of this courtyard was very tyrannical. She smiled slightly and spun her body, causing the nearby trees to tremble slightly. A dozen more flower petals fell. She looked at Fan Xian and said in a soft and charming voice, "Tell me, do you think I've finally won against your mother?" Fan Xian had long sunk into a strange emotion. Suddenly hearing these words, he didn't know how to respond. He could only smile bitterly again and again. The eldest princess stepped on her bare feet and slowly danced on the green grass. She carried a gentle, relaxed, and joyful emotion. Looking at this scene, for some reason, Fan Xian felt an incomparable anger in his heart. Yes, you all stood higher than everyone else and saw further than everyone else. Regardless of whether it was the emperor or Li Yunrui, their gazes were never on Jingdo from the beginning. Instead, they were fixed on Dong Mountain and the 4 great grandmasters who should not have existed in this world. How many people died? How many families were destroyed in Jingdo? How many soldiers of the Qing kingdom have lost their heads and lost their lives because they wanted to leave their names in the annals of history? How many people cried bitterly and grieved? You are not as good as her, Fan Xian suddenly said. The eldest princess's bare feet suddenly stopped on the grass. She turned her head and looked at Fan Xian with a cold gaze. It was as if she was waiting for him to give an explanation. Fan Xian raised his brows and continued to sit on the ground. With slight mockery, he said, "When my mother came into this world, she could at least make the Qing people laugh. You can only make the people of the world cry." Li Yunrui smiled faintly and revealed a mocking expression. She was not moved at all. However, Fan Xian's following words made her angry. Fan Xian shook his head and said in a matter-of-fact tone, "I've seen my mother's portrait. I have to say, she was prettier than you." Fan Xian smiled. "Everyone loves Yi Qingmei, isn't that so?" He stood up and patted the grass off his butt, not looking at Li Yunrui's expression. Since he knew that the eldest princess had the will to die at the beginning of her plan and only hoped for the last bit of glory in the world before going to the underworld to find her lover, Fan Xian was tired. He only wanted to provoke her, create a variable, and find a way to save Wan, and Bao. Of course, there was still a gargantuan doubt circling around his heart. Would the emperor be able to survive in the turbulence of the Grand Master's battle? Chapter 575. If time was a clock that could be accurately calculated and could be controlled at will, then let us follow the clock in the scene of passing through time and start moving in the opposite direction, returning to the time of the Great Dong Mountain. Let us see the drenched yellow robe, the burning sword, the middle-aged man the tip of the sword pointed at, and countless people in the rain. Then, the second hand gently struggled, bounced, and passed the first grid. Following Sigurd Jian's finger, the long sword that had been floating in the air suddenly flew out. Circling around his body in a semicircle, it pierced straight toward the Qing Emperor's back. Yi Luyun had already come to the Qing Emperor's side and stretched out his pure white hands that were like metal and stone. The sword had already pierced through the air and tore through the thick yuanqi that might or might not have existed on Dong Mountain. In the next second, it seemed like it was going to pierce into the Emperor's back. However, that pair of pure white and even somewhat childish hands exceeded everyone's expectations as they gently pressed towards the sword. The situation of the great grandmasters surrounding and killing the Qing Emperor on Dong Mountain finally underwent a shocking change. Yi Luyun attacked the sword and not the Emperor. The first thing that came into contact with this killing sword was Yi Luyun's sleeve. The wide sleeves were woven from linen. In that instant, they became extremely soft. They were like the clouds that often floated on the mountainside of Dong Mountain when there was no rain. They softly wrapped around the rapidly flying sword in layers. The strands of clouds snapped, and the hemp sleeves shattered into butterflies that danced on the summit of Dong Mountain. The sword, on the other hand, had expended its essence in such a gentle entanglement. The coldness and killing intent it carried suddenly disappeared. It became a piece of scrap metal, dim, lightless, and very petty. The power of this sword was too vicious and severe. After Yi Luyun recited a verse, he had no choice but to come out and protect the emperor's safety. However, when he revealed his true position, he was unable to find the most critical point to carry out an ambush. How should he deal with the following situation? Yi Luyun's white beard was soaked by the rain, but his eyes looked seriously at the sword in his hand. He did not feel any contempt because of the sword's dimness. He also did not feel any unease because he had been forced to attack early and was unable to kill Siga Jian. He just looked at the sword seriously and held it in his hand. It was as if this ordinary sword contained countless ghosts and gods that would come out at any moment and devour everyone on the mountaintop. His hands, which were as steady as jade, formed an illusory circle. The mouth of his thumb and index finger turned into a circle. The silent and lightless heavenly sword abruptly stood motionless in midair. He was a great grandmaster, so he knew that all of Siga Jian's sword intent was contained in this sword. If he still did not act, the body of the sword would completely pierce into the emperor's body. He had wandered the 4 seas for many years for this moment. However, he had been forced to act early. Siga Jian was not truly an idiot. Just as the eldest princess had expected, although he had not expected Yi Luyun to stand on the Qing emperor's side, these 2 great grandmasters of northern Qi and Dongyi had the deepest understanding of the Qing people's sinister and cunning. Until the last moment, they would not allow themselves to sink into danger. The short body wearing the straw hat actually contained the wisdom of a great grandmaster that was completely different from his reputation in history. He only used this sword outside his body to break the Qing emperor's plan and force out the true killer on Dong Mountain, Yi Luyun. Just as Yi Luyun stood in front of the Qing emperor like a bright sun with his hands in a circle, forcefully suppressing the sharp sword, Siga Jian's body began to tremble. The hemp clothing on his body shook violently like it had been struck by lightning. His sword had already flown into the air and stopped between Yi Luyun's steady hands. Following the shaking of his body, a startling sword intent pierced through the hemp clothing he wore and shot into the sky. Summoned by this sword intent, the sword Yi Luyun's bare hands controlled also began to tremble violently. It buzzed in the air and shone with light again. The rain continued to pour down on Dong Mountain. In such a short period of time, the raindrops seemed to be moving at a strangely slow speed, delicately sensing the attractive force of the earth. They no longer fell in a torrential downpour. Instead, they were like sparkling and translucent pearls. Behind the heavy curtain of pearls and jade, the short man in hemp clothing used his body as a sword. His momentum broke through the heavens and the earth. Just like that, he traversed more than 100 feet and arrived in front of Yi Luyun like a bolt of lightning. He stretched out his hand and pressed down on the ordinary sword that he had worn by his side for decades. Siga Jian's hand once again gripped his sword. The tip of the sword spat out wildly like a silver snake dancing chaotically with an imposing aura. Just as the still curtain of rain was forcefully broken through by the hemp-clothed Siga Jian, Yi Luyun's eyes abruptly shone with a bright light. Like a flowing cloud enveloping the sun, he forcefully absorbed the sun's energy. With a muffled grunt, his 2 palms, which had formed a circle, came together inwards. With a crisp clap, the empty air was like solid metal. A moment later, it was forcefully crushed by this pair of pure white hands and merged with the body of the sword. For a great grandmaster, there were no traps. Even though the Qing emperor had set up a trap and hidden Yi Luyun until the end, Siga Jian had still easily pierced through the layers of fog with one strike. Immediately after, Siga Jian used this great opportunity to pour all of his sword power back into the sword. To Yi Luyun's side was the Qing emperor. Faced with this swift and fierce strike, he could not dodge it. He could only use the cloud hand to forcefully block it. However, when the endless sword power was matched against the physical body, Yi Luyun could not use his Sanzhou techniques to his heart's content. Sigurd had seized this opportunity. In a battle between great grandmasters, the occasional thought could change the color of heaven and earth. It only needed a slight shift for the situation to shift. Sigurd cried out shrilly and crazily. All of the ruthless sword chi in his body surged into the sword in his hand. The speed at which the sword chi surged was so fast that the hilt of the sword in his hand suddenly became hot. With a whoosh, it evaporated all of the water on the grass rope. The terrifying sound of metal scraping against stone rang out. The long sword between Yi Luyun's tightly clasped hands advanced an inch. Yi Luyun's head remained slightly lowered. The wide sleeves on his arms had long become butterflies dancing in the air around him. The most stable pair of arms in the world held the sword tightly between them. A moment later, the skin on his hands began to crack inch by inch. It was like a patient who had contracted some kind of skin disease. The skin aged, and the edges curled up. It looked like the land during the drought in the 5th year of the Qing calendar, cracking open. It was strangely terrifying and miraculous. His eyes were filled with a calm gaze as he watched the sword in his hands inch closer to his body. He did not reveal a glimmer of emotion. He only spat out one word. Cloud. Following this word, the two arms, whose skin had already cracked open by the supreme sword chi, abruptly became soft. They were deeper than the ocean, softer than lake water, and purer than the eyes of a Jiangnan woman. They were the clouds in the sky. Strands of the clouds were like longing. Strand by strand, they were tied to the startling sword. It made the extremely powerful sword suddenly meet with gentleness and had no choice but to temporarily stop along the way. In this short second, the heavens, in good humor, bestowed a bolt of lightning that lit up the particularly dark mountaintop covered by dark clouds. The lightning lit up Sigurd face under his bamboo hat. His eyes were filled with a wild aura like that of a wild beast. He didn't say a single word. He only howled shrilly. The howl echoed through Dong Mountain and knocked countless people unconscious. He was a great grandmaster who used the sword. He used the Siga sword. He focused on what was in front and disregarded what was behind, pressing forward with an indomitable will. The power of the sword surged out along with the howl. The rising ruthlessness could not be stopped. Boundless murderous intent and ruthless aura were all in this strike. This was the most powerful strike Sigurd had made since he was born. It was a strike formed from his entire life, spirit, and belief. The power of the sword was swift and ruthless. It already had traces of being heaven-defying. On this land, no one had ever made such a strike before. There probably wouldn't be one in the future. No one could stop it. Not even Yi Luyun. In a situation, it was often difficult to distinguish between the people in the situation and the people outside the situation. The people who planned to win often only realized in the moment things ended that no matter how they had schemed against themselves and ruined their lives. The development of things would always drift further and further away from the original plans of those in control. If he had known everything that had happened in this second when the clock stopped, perhaps the Qing emperor would have chosen to gather the tiger guards on the mountain at the very beginning and have the Qing kingdom's two great grandmasters face off against Ku He and Sigurd. With Wu Zhu at the side, he could have swung his knife after the 100 tiger guards were mutually wounded. How could the situation now have occurred? In the most important day of Sigurd's life, he perfectly demonstrated the wisdom and decisiveness of a great grandmaster. He only used one strike to force Yi Luyun out. He also perfectly used the Qing emperor's plan and the Qing emperor's life to force Yi Luyun into a hopeless situation. If Sigurd had not used up some of his energy when he was climbing the stairs to heaven on Dong Mountain to kill the 100 tiger guards with one strike, perhaps that startling strike would have long pierced into Yi Luyun's abdomen. Of course, if he had not used the fresh blood of 100 Qing aces as a sacrifice to this sword to accumulate boundless bloody killing intent, perhaps Sigurd would not have been able to use such a heartless and ruthless strike. Yi Luyun had 3 ways to deal with this strike. Just like the last of the 36 stratagems in that world, when the situation had developed to an extreme, the best method was often the simplest method. Given this Qing Great Grandmaster's peerless movements and Luyun San's Ho, when faced with Sigurd startling strike, he could have chosen to retreat and escape. He could have used the San's Ho sea of clouds to temporarily seal the edge of the sword for a moment. He only needed a moment to leave the area enveloped by the sword power. However, the Emperor was by his side. If he dodged, the Emperor would probably be turned into a sky full of minced meat under this heavenly sword. Thus, Yi Luyun did not dodge. At this moment, he was already unable to dodge. Wu Zhu, who had been standing silently at the door of the old temple, lowered his head. At some point, his hand had once again landed on the handle of the metal drill by his waist. The Emperor's life was on the line, but he still did not act. In the last-minute moment of this second, a slight smile suddenly flashed across Yi Luyun's crude face. It appeared particularly strange for this smile to appear at such a moment. A portion of the cloud-like hands was suddenly blown away by the wind on the summit of the mountain. It swept up and headed straight for Sigurd's face. Before the cloud arrived, the straw hat had already flown far away. The strong wind hit his face and blew directly at Sigurd's face. Since he could not block this strike, then why should he? Yi Luyun chose to remove one hand and spread out a patch of cloud to cover Sigurd's face. This was what low-level martial artists were best at, besieging the enemy to rescue the besieged. However, in the hands of this great grandmaster, it appeared free and at ease, leaving and leaving as he wished. It was a patch of cloud on the horizon. Following the ruthless and soaring sword intent, it gently and quickly floated towards Sigurd's face. If Sigurd ignored this San's Ho and the long sword pierced into Yi Luyun's abdomen, with the sword intent and murderous aura contained in the sword, it could instantly shred Yi Luyun's organs to pieces. Even if Yi Luyun luckily survived, he would no longer have any ability to fight. If he wanted to avoid this San's Ho, with just a thought, a gap would naturally appear in the spirit that poured into the sword. How could an imperfect and ruthless swordsmanship stab a great grandmaster under the sword? Yi Luyun's choice at this moment was very wise. It could even be said to be wonderful. He knew that his cloud could not heavily injure Sigurd, but he forced Sigurd to make a choice in such a short amount of time. He used his life to gamble on Sigurd's heavy injury. He could clearly sense that Sigurd had already advanced into a realm of absolute killing. However, there was still Wu Zhu, Eunuch Yao, and everyone else at the summit. Yi Luyun could die, but Sigurd could not be heavily injured. A heavily injured Sigurd could not guarantee that he could kill the Qing Emperor. Such an outcome was something Sigurd could not accept. Thus, his cloud flew out and waited for Sigurd to change his sword. But, Sigurd did not change his sword. A wild aura continued to shine through his eyes. His black hair danced wildly in the mountain wind. He looked like a demon holding a sword. His aura was intimidating. The long sword continued to press toward Yi Luyun with an indomitable will. His left hand, however, was empty, pointing diagonally to the left. He didn't pay any attention to the cloud that was rushing towards him at all. There were tens of thousands of sword techniques in the world, but there was only one way to hold a sword. Sigurd's left hand was in the most standard way to hold a sword. The space between his thumb and forefingers was empty. Suddenly, a weak sword intent seeped out from the emptiness. Although it was weak, it was unusually easy to kill the bright yellow figure that the empty sword in his left hand pointed toward. Yi Luyun attacked Sigurd and had no choice but to save him. Sigurd held the hilt of his sword and used sword intent to break through the air to counterattack Yi Luyun. Chapter 576. On Dong Mountain. In order to ensure the harmony and ruthlessness of this strike, Sigurd had poured all of his energy into it. If he had to deal with the flowing cloud Yi Luyun sent out, he would have to pull back his sword. If he didn't, he could only attack the enemy's weakness. However, he could only split out a sliver of his attention. Of the 5 people present, the only person he could kill with just a sliver of his attention was the Qing Kingdom's emperor, who had an empty aura. It had to be said that from the beginning of Sigurd attack, in terms of aura and intelligence, he had suppressed Yi Luyun. At this moment, he gave Yi Luyun a difficult problem and a surprise. What made Sigurd surprised, angry, uneasy, and at a loss was that Yi Luyun did not pay any attention to the empty sword Sigurd held. That ball of flowing cloud continued to move toward his face. The empty sword in his hand, after emitting a faint, cheat sound, pierced through the wet stone slabs of the mountain peak and fell into the air. The bright yellow and dim eyes on the dragon robes suddenly and strangely disappeared from the front of the empty sword. On the summit of Dong Mountain, 4 great grandmasters, and an emperor. Everything seemed to take a long time. In reality, it only happened in a second. In this second, Sigurd used the sword in his hand to pick up Yi Luyun's cloud and used the empty sword to stab toward the Qing emperor. On the other side of this second, an even more hair-raising story happened. This story happened at the beginning of this second. When Sigurd sword flew to within a foot of the Qing emperor's back, the emperor had already sighed darkly and released the old hand that had been holding eunuch Hong the entire time. It was as if he did not want this old man to be unable to enjoy the last battle of his life. At this moment, the Northern Qi imperial advisor Ku He's hand was perseveringly brushing against old eunuch Hong's chest. This brush and press, with his thumb and index finger slightly apart, was like a cool breeze brushing against a mountain. It was gentle and natural. It was completely different from the storm and lightning around them. However, when the wind brushed past, the mountain was thrown into chaos for no reason. Old eunuch Hong gazed calmly at Ku He's face. His hands were like a pair of dragon whips, twisting and changing shape as they climbed onto Ku He's right arm. However, they did not stop his brush. With a muffled thud, old eunuch Hong's chest completely shattered. Under Ku He's natural and refreshing brush that contained the might of heaven and earth, his sternum was like a fragile piece of tofu. They all collapsed and caved in. Blood gushed out of old eunuch Hong's nose, mouth, and mouth. His life force was rapidly drained away as his sternum caved in, his blood gushed out wildly, and his vital energy flowed out. However, there was a hint of a faint smile, mockery, and killing intent in his aged eyes. An abyss-like feeling of emptiness came from his palm. Master Ku He's pupils suddenly constricted. This was the oldest great-grandmaster present, the uncle of the founding emperor of Northern Qi, and the once brilliant ascetic monk of the Wei Kingdom. No one knew how many things had happened in his life. He had gone to the temple to seek the way and discuss martial arts with the world. His temperament was steady and natural. No one could compare to him. Today, the 4 great grandmasters were gathered at Dong Mountain. He had to pick up his sense of gain and loss again. He had to pull the heart of victory and defeat back into his hands. The tyrannical Jinqi emanating from the body of this old eunuch, who had hidden himself in the Qing kingdom for many years, was like the dry wind in the surroundings. The realm hidden within was, without question, that he was already a proper grandmaster. Thus, Master Ku he did not hold back. He did not dare to hold back. This second brush of leaning against the mountains and rivers already contained the bottomless heavens path Jinqi in his body. In a battle between great grandmasters, some shocking changes could happen at any time. Thus, when Ku-hee's brush landed on old eunuch Hong's chest, he did not feel a glimmer of joy. The first brush had already been forcefully bounced back by the tyrannical Jinqi in old eunuch Hong's body. Although this kind of qi circulation method was overly tyrannical and could not be maintained for long, Ku-hee thought that old eunuch Hong would certainly have a way to deal with his second brush. However, old eunuch Hong did not manage to block this brush. His chest shattered. The tyrannical aura on the old eunuch's body disappeared without a trace in an instant. No one knew where it had gone. Even if old eunuch Hong's chest suddenly became a metal plate and grew a second head, perhaps Ku-hee would not be surprised. Yet, this scene made Ku-hee feel incredulous. Where did the abundant and irresistible tyrannical Jinqi go? In the end, a great grandmaster was a person and not a god. Even with his and Sigurd Jian's miraculous cultivation, it was impossible for them to abruptly disperse the aura that had already reached the peak of the human world in such a short time. It was like a ball filled with energy. How could it completely dissipate in an instant? The transfer of any kind of energy always required time. The shorter the time, the more terrifying the shaking during this process. Regardless of whether it was Ku-hee, Sigurd Jian, or Yi Luyun, if they were like old eunuch Hong and completely released all of the Jinqi in their bodies in such a short time, they could not avoid the fate of their bodies falling apart and dying in the next moment. Why? Why could old eunuch Hong do this? Why did he dare to do this? Ku-hee's pupils constricted. A raindrop stopped half an inch in front of his eyelids, reflecting a faint black light. He unconsciously sensed an unfamiliar sense of danger, the sense of death. In his long journey of life, the last time Master Ku-hee had sunk into such a state of mind was when he reunited with the blind man in the 5th year of the Qing calendar. However, the danger he sensed then was not as great as now. When these thoughts swept through Master Ku-hee's mind like a sky full of raindrops, his gentle right hand had already shattered Hong Xiang's sternum. Like a hot knife through butter, it broke through the thin and old body and extended out from his back. His heart, which had been shattered into 5 pieces, sprayed out arrows of blood in a frightening manner under the still curtain of raindrops. Hong Xiang was already dead. No one could survive after their heart had been shattered. His body was bent. He no longer had the godlike domineering appearance that Sigurd Jian had when he ascended the mountain. Instead, he was like a pitiful dwarf, covered in blood, hanging from Ku-hee's right hand. Hong Xiang was not dead. Although his heart had been shattered and his breath was gone, the meridians in his body still maintained the state they were in before he died. All of his Jinqi was desperately being released toward heaven and earth. From the end of his meridians, it scattered into the surrounding nature. It was like a black hole. Although it was deathly still, it relied on some miraculous law and used his body and meridians as a bridge to send out, absorb, and dim. Including the arm in his body. Master Ku-hee had used all of his strength in this brush. The abundant Jinqi in his body seeped out from every pore and inch of skin. Following Hong Xiang's reversal of the secret method that used his life as the price, it endlessly leaked outwards. Ku-hee's eyes lit up. It was not an understanding. It was a feeling. The raindrop less than an inch in front of his eyes was still floating in the air. He already understood that he had fallen into a trap. Dong Mountain itself was a trap. Hong Xiang was not a great grandmaster. The domineering aura he had released earlier at the top of the mountain was borrowed. His realm was also borrowed. It was because it was not his own that he was able to release it with all his strength at the expense of his body and spirit. That was why it appeared particularly ruthless and did not seem to be at the level a human should have. Hong Xiang had long prepared to die. Someone wanted to use his death to absorb a bit of his Jinqi. His final brush, which relied on the mountain and water, had already sent out his Jinqi. A gap had already appeared in the protection of his body and life. That person wanted to use this gap. That person had displayed the incomparably wondrous realm through Hong Xiang. Having no time to sense the changes between the sword fanatic and Lu Yun, Master Ku He's eyes grew brighter. Like an autumn moon, it appeared without warning in a pool of green water. His favorite female disciple, Hai Tang, had the cleanest and brightest eyes in the world. If compared to Ku He's eyes, it was like comparing a firefly to a bright moon. Ku He was the person with the most meticulous perception of his surroundings in the world. His personality was the most gentle but also the strongest. This could be seen from his trip to the temple many years ago. When he discovered that old eunuch Hong was a trap, his reaction followed. There was no one else in the world who could change so quickly. Perhaps it was only 1/100th of a second. He should have reacted a bit faster than the person who set the trap had imagined. But, it was very likely a fatal time difference. Ku He's eyes were as bright as the moon and as pure as the lone star. He took a deep breath. With this breath, it was as if he wanted to suck in all of the air on the peak of Dong Mountain. The old man's chest suddenly swelled up. His entire body seemed to have grown 2 inches. Following this breath, the supreme Jinqi of Tianyi Dao in his body also began to breathe from his right arm. It followed the natural inhalation and exhalation of the world and easily broke free from the pull of the aura emanating from Hong Xiang's body. It began to use the fastest speed to circulate through his meridians. Only Tianyi Dao's peaceful method could display such a fast change so naturally. There was no difference between time and stillness. There was no time to make any movement controlled by muscles. However, the Jinqi that flowed through a person's body like mercury and light could faintly break through the limits of time and complete its mission. The Jinqi flowed back. Eunuch Hong's thin and weak body turned into a mist of blood that filled the sky but did not have time to dissipate. No one noticed that Ku He's left hand, which hung by his side, naturally curled up a finger and drew a semicircle in the air, making a hand gesture that had never appeared on this land. Following this hand gesture, the rain that filled the sky once again paused. The faint aura that was mixed in the wind and rain on the peak of Dong Mountain and soaked in the ruins of the ancient temple poured into his body at an astonishing speed. The aura summoned by the strange hand gesture was very weak. In such a dangerous moment, a stick of firewood or a drop of water were all precious existences in a battle between grandmasters. What exactly was this hand gesture? It could actually suck in Jinqi from the empty air and the eaves of the temple. Magic. The magic that the sorcerers practiced on the other side of the ocean. Yet, it had appeared in Master Ku He's hands. On the rain-drenched Dong Mountain, the Northern Qi Imperial Advisor Ku He finally used his greatest trump card. He used a method that was usually of no help, but at this moment, could help him speed up the recovery of his Jinqi. When he fought against Wu Zhu, he had not used this magical treasure. But now, he used it without hesitation. In the instant that old eunuch Hong died, before the mist of blood had time to disperse, a hand as white as jade, stretched out from the mist of blood. This scene appeared strangely strange. A hand as steady as white jade stretched out from the bloody mist. It was like a divine hand reaching out from the depths of hell to plunder all life in the world. In the instant he sensed this hand, the light in Ku He's eyes grew brighter and brighter. His first reaction was normal. This hand should be Yi Liuyun's. Only Yi Liuyun's hand could be so steady and wondrous. However, Ku He was not afraid. The Tianyi Dao Jinqi in his body had long returned to his body. The faint yuanqi of heaven and earth summoned by a miraculous spell had also seeped into his meridians through his 36,000 pores. The Jinqi in his body had already reached its peak. With each tremble, it had reached the limit that a human could contain. If Ku-he wanted to use old eunuch Hong's death to create an opening in his power, then Ku-he's strangely fast reaction and the magic hand gesture that no one had expected perfectly filled in this opening. In fact, it was a bit too perfect. That spotlessly white hand suddenly hid the radiance on its skin, but it appeared even more terrifying. Even in such a high-speed realm, it didn't tremble in the slightest. With an unbelievable level of stability and power, it passed through that bloody mist with incredible speed and pressed down. As it moved, the hand loosened 4 fingers. The index finger curled up slightly. The soft and firm fingertip broke the drop of rain an inch in front of Master Ku-he's eyes. It then gently landed between his brows. It was as if it was going to mark a bright red mole between his brows. The drop of rain was broken by the finger and turned into a small hollow water circle. Beautiful ripples floated around it as it slowly expanded. However, a red mole did not appear between Ku-he's brows. On the contrary, it grew brighter. It was as if all the light in Ku-he's dimming eyes had been sent to the space between his brows. Master Ku-he used the supreme Jinqi of Tianyi Dao he had cultivated for decades and the Yuan Qi of heaven and earth he had summoned through a spell to gather between his brows and forcefully resist this beautiful finger. The slightly curled and steady index finger did not forcefully resist the pure Jinqi between his brows. Instead, it used a slow and gentle method to pour in. There was no ruthlessness, no intent to kill, and no natural aura. There was only the most upright and proper rules of the world. The way of the king. The tip of the finger moved down again. With a whoosh, it swiftly pointed out and pierced directly into Ku-he's chest. Although it was just the movement of a finger, it faintly made one feel like there was the movement of a dragon or a tiger. One finger had the dignity of an emperor. Ku-he had already pulled back his right hand. With a serious expression, he raised his thumb. Miraculously, it met the index finger and made a muffled thud. The index finger moved down again, piercing straight into Ku-he's abdomen. Ku-he lowered his eyelids. His hemp clothing swayed slightly. His flat finger became a palm. His right palm was like a trickling stream flowing with the mountain. It naturally hung down and blocked the finger in front of his abdomen. All of this proceeded as if it should be. However, Ku-he's body began to tremble violently. A red spot appeared in the center of his right palm. It sizzled like a red-hot branding iron. The steady hand only stretched out 3 fingers. These 3 fingers were not meant to kill, to destroy, or to resist. Instead, they were meant to give. They were upright and straightforward, without the slightest hint of a sneak attack. The heart and bearing of a monarch were all contained within these 3 fingers, and the aura of the Tao of Kings was completely revealed. Another bolt of lightning rang out in the sky. Ku-he's body was like a kite with its string cut. Dispiritedly and powerlessly, he flew into the distance toward the large tree beside the stone path on Dong Mountain. He sat cross-legged and sighed. Ku-he knew he had been wrong. He had been wrong from the very beginning. The most fatal mistake had happened 3 fingers ago. After he realized that Hong Xiang was a trap, his reaction speed had been too fast. His method of response had been too sufficient. He had raised his realm too perfectly. At that moment, Ku-he was like a large tree that reached into the clouds and reached the highest point in the world. He was like a lake of autumn water that had already formed a vast and mighty force. That person had only extended 3 fingers and poured about half of the Jinqi in his body into Ku-he's body. With the power of the Way of the King, a tyrannical aura was poured in. Master Ku-he, who had to endure all of this in such a short time, was like a large tree that reached into the clouds being pressed down by another giant tree. It was like the heavens had suddenly poured half a lake of autumn water into the full lake. When the water was full, it overflowed. The lake dam collapsed. The tree trunk also snapped in the middle with a crack. Compared to mortals, a great grandmaster's state of mind was close to that of a god. He was known as the person closest to a god in the world. In the end, great grandmasters had their own weaknesses. Their weakness was their physical bodies. The meridians in their bodies had a limit. There was also a limit to what the physical body could endure. The jinqi that had been poured in by the 3 fingers had forcefully broken through He's limit. The meridians and physical body in his body had received irreparable damage. Sitting cross-legged under the tree, he felt the swelling sensation from his skin. There was still a glimmer of doubt in his heart. How could the owner of that hand be able to spit out so much jinqi in such a short time? This was a speed that the meridians of the human body could not endure. Everything should have already ended. When Hong Xiang turned into a bloody mist, the empty sword in Siga Jian's left hand stabbed out at a slanted angle. He stabbed empty air. He had no choice but to save Yi Luyun, but Yi Luyun did not save him at all. That ball of flowing cloud had already covered Siga Jian's face. Siga Jian trembled in anger and cried out wretchedly. Lowering his head, he twisted his right wrist. The sword pressed toward Yi Luyun's abdomen. The illusory sword in his left hand missed. Immediately after, he lowered his head. A weak spot finally appeared in the ruthless and harmonious sword. However, he had to dodge because he knew the situation had changed. He had to survive. Siga Jian survived. Half of his face had been smashed to pieces by Yi Luyun Sanzhou. Yi Luyun also survived. He lowered his head coldly and tightened his left hand around the sword, only allowing it to enter an inch into his abdomen. It was not over. Yi Luyun Sanzhou had not ended its momentum. It cleaved down and struck Siga Jian's shoulder with a thud. His 5 fingers were like a dragon's claw. They shot out from the cloud and sank deep into flesh and bone. It was as if Siga Jian did not feel any pain. He pulled back his left hand and struck his wrist with it. The long sword entered another inch into Yi Luyun's abdomen. Then, the tip of the sword flashed with light. It was shattered by the powerful sword force and bloomed into a beautiful flower. This was a terrifying sword strike. Although it had encountered many unexpected problems along the way, it still relied on the ruthlessness it carried from the beginning to successfully heavily injure Yi Luyun. At this moment, the ball of bloody mist dissipated. A bright yellow figure appeared from behind the bloody mist. It seemed to hide the fact that every emperor had to use the blood of countless people to pave the foundation of his immortal empire. The bright yellow figure appeared between Yi Luyun and Siga Jian and threw out a punch. There were no flashy moves or techniques involved. It was just a simple and clear strike. However, there was no one in the world who could throw out such a simple and clear punch. It was open and aboveboard, yet it made it impossible for one to dodge. In fact, it was impossible to dodge. First, there was a tearing sound. His body received a powerful jinqi attack. Siga Jian's right arm, which had been grabbed by Yi Luyun's dragon claw, broke apart. Immediately after, there was a muffled sound like that of an ancient temple's bell. A complicated expression flashed through Siga Jian's eyes. Looking at the bright yellow figure in front of him, his entire body was sent flying. With that expression, Siga Jian flew with his broken arm and smashed through the wooden door of Dongshan Qing Temple. The powerful force smashed through countless structures in the ancient temple. Like a large boulder, he crushed everything his body came into contact with. In the end, he crashed into the large bell in the small ancestral hall in the depths of the ancient temple and made a ringing sound. On the opposite side of the ancient temple, under a large tree by the stone path, Ku He, dressed in hemp clothing, watched this scene with a perplexed expression. He sat cross-legged. It was as if he had been triggered by the sound of the bell. something in his body suddenly exploded. Immediately after, it shrank. Fresh blood seeped out of his eyes and ears. The large tree behind Ku-he collapsed with a rumble and shattered into pieces. The stones within a 5-foot radius around him were all squeezed into three-dimensional surfaces by the Jinchi that exploded out of his body. They were either ferocious or sorrowful as they raised their sharp corners to welcome the last of the rain from the heavens. Most of the buildings in the old temple of Qing had become ruins. The ancient myths and legends painted in oil had become powdered memories of the past. The moss-covered pool was missing a large opening, and the rainwater inside flowed out, mixing with the soil and stones and becoming murky. A few white cranes, stunned by the commotion, cowered timidly behind the pool. A yellow cloth fell to the ground, covering Sigurd Jian's body lying on the ground at the end of the wretched passageway. Only Sigurd Jian's weak voice could be heard under the yellow cloth, wretchedly cursing something. However, his voice was already very weak. It was completely covered up by the sound of the bell above his head. The buzzing sound of the bell rang through the entire summit of Dong Mountain. The hurricane by the seaside came quickly and left quickly, just like the impermanence of the world and the happiness and anger of emperors. Earlier, there had been a violent storm. Suddenly, the wind and rain stopped. The dark clouds in the sky abruptly parted to reveal a gentle porcelain blue sky behind the clouds. A ray of light shone down clearly and landed on the bright yellow figure by the cliff of Dong Mountain, illuminating his face clearly. The Qing emperor stood where he was with a pale face. His 4 limbs were trembling. Half of the tyrannical Jinchi in his body had been poured into Ku-he's body. The last fist of the way of the emperor had squeezed out the last of his spirit. He was extremely tired. The light of the sky was faint. The most powerful ruler in the world had his dragon robe drenched by the rain. His hair was also messy and hung weakly on his forehead. The calmness in his eyes contained countless emotions that could not be understood. In his life, he had never been so wretched. In his life, he had never been so powerful. I hope everyone is satisfied. I need everyone's monthly votes to encourage me. I've done my best. I'm satisfied. Today's chapter will be later because I have to do my best. This is like the archery championship earlier. As long as I do my best, I will win. Thank you. I'm very tired. Chapter 577. On the shore of the ocean, on Dong Mountain, the umpteenth hurricane in the 7th year of the Qing calendar stopped without a sound. In the following period of time, this hurricane would bring rare rainwater to the Qing kingdom, which was already showing signs of a slight drought. Furthermore, it was very gentle and did not cause too great a disaster. After the attack of the storm, the old eaves of the old temple on the mountaintop had become a pile of ruins. The ground was covered in rubble. Mud and stone flew everywhere. It was a tragic sight to behold. The rainwater first washed over it and then quickly flowed down the mountain, forming sections of pure white waterfalls on the jade-like precipices. Occasionally, there was a sliver of a faint blood-red color in the waterfalls. On the contrary, the mountaintop gradually became clean. There wasn't even a trace of the smell of blood left. Was such a scene created by the might of heaven or the Grand Master's world-shaking battle? In reality, it was the might of heaven. The sky above the summit of Dong Mountain had gradually revealed its true appearance. The thick black clouds were blown away by the strong wind. At a speed visible to the naked eye, they quickly moved toward the sky inland in the west. A bright and clear light once again descended on the summit of the mountain and onto the body of the most powerful man in the world by the precipice. He was the most powerful person in the world, bar none. No one dared to call him by his name because he was the emperor of the most powerful Qing kingdom. He was a famous general who had led an army on 3 northern expeditions, forcefully breaking the Wei kingdom into pieces, and completely changing the shape of the world's territories. He was the schemer who used the emperor's schemes the most thoroughly, the most tolerant, and the most tenacious. Just these 3 identities were enough for him to be called the most powerful person in the world. Furthermore, at the end of the Dong Mountain killing situation, his last identity was revealed. The most mysterious of the 4 great grandmasters in the world, the strange creature rumored to have always guarded the Qing palace and not come out. Siga Jian had entered Jingdou alone but had been forced back by the tyrannical power released by the royal palace, thus indirectly proving his existence. It was the emperor of the Qing kingdom. This was the emperor's final trump card. Fan Xian had once been puzzled. Just what kind of foundation was the emperor's powerful self-confidence and natural bearing built on? Many people were guessing at the emperor's trump card. In the last moment, Fan Xian guessed that it was the Yi family, but he would never have guessed that this flipped trump card had the word Grandmaster written on it. Hong Xixiang was just a cover, a flagpole sticking out from the back of the palace, gently swaying in the dark wind of the night, attracting the attention of all the wise men. Without a doubt, this old eunuch was one of the strongest in the world. Otherwise, he would not have been able to kill the Hu assassin in the floating temple with one palm. However, it was difficult for an abnormal person to reach the peak of the heavenly path. In order to kill Ku He and Siga Jian in one fell swoop, the Qing emperor and eunuch Hong had worked painstakingly and cautiously for a full 20 years. Old eunuch Hong had already gloriously completed his mission of 20 years and turned into a bloody mist that filled the sky. Washed by the torrential rain and washed by the cool wind, it entered the white waterfall and fell into the East Sea. It entered the moist air of the forest and moistened the earth. His life essence, blood, and flesh all merged into the beautiful landscape of the Qing kingdom and could no longer be separated. Looking at the middle-aged man in the bright yellow dragon robe, the people present who had luckily survived all sank into a boundless shock. Everyone's throat seemed to be pinched by an invisible hand, unable to make a single sound. Without question, the truth that had unfolded on the peak of Dong Mountain was the most shocking and world-shaking news since the sudden death of Lady Yi 20 years ago. The ringing of the bell coming from the ruins of the ancient temple gradually grew weaker and calmed down. Beside the roots of the large tree that had already been shattered into countless pieces of bark, the northern Qi imperial advisor Ku He, dressed in tattered hemp clothing, looked calmly at the Qing emperor at the edge of the cliff with a clear gaze in his eyes. The ruthless and tyrannical Jinqi in his body finally calmed down as the ringing of the bell stopped. He knew that his internal organs and 13 meridians had already been invaded into a chaotic mess by this Jinqi. Even the temple would not be able to save him. After understanding reality, he immediately accepted it. His dignity and state of mind as a great grandmaster made Ku He's expression very calm. He looked at the Qing emperor and gently sighed. His eyes had already seen through everything. Everyone had lost. They had lost to the other party's 20 years of enduring and disguise. This was a terrifying and respectable opponent. To be able to endure for so long and not let anyone catch wind of it, this made Ku He feel even more respect than the shocking truth that the Qing emperor was a great grandmaster. Ku He couldn't help but think of the numerous conversations he had with the Empress Dowager and the emperor before he left Shangjing. At that time, his grandson had a bad omen. However, Ku He had still floated over because he and Siga Jian had made ample preparations. These 2 great grandmasters had not anticipated that the emperor would make a move. Every trick and scheme has ended up costing you your life. Ku He sighed gently. A smile of knowing his destiny rose to his face. Involuntarily, he quietly spat out a sentence that the child had recorded in a book. In terms of tenacity and endurance, of the millions of people in this world, there was no one with a heart stronger than the Qing emperors. Although he felt a glimmer of worry for his home, He did not feel any regret losing to such an opponent. In the instant the Emperor made his move, Wu Zhu tightened his grip on the metal drill and immediately put it down. Having done this 3 times, he finally let go of the metal drill and placed his hands behind his back. The black cloth on his face fluttered in the wind and rain of Dong Mountain. During the Grandmaster's battle, everyone on the mountaintop knelt on the ground and used the trembling of their bodies to express their respect. Only he stood coldly and even somewhat woodenly, watching all of this from the sidelines. He sat under the tree while Siga Jian rang the bell. Wu Zhu tilted his head slightly. On his usually expressionless face, the corners of his lips couldn't help but twitch. The fact that the Emperor was a great Grandmaster would certainly shock the entire world. However, Wu Zhu still only tilted his head and looked calmly at the Emperor through the black cloth like he was looking at a strange object. He did not look at him like he was the sun in the sky. In this instant, Wu Zhu seemed to remember something but seemed to immediately forget it. His brows furrowed in a rare moment as he remembered something Chen Pingping had once said. After the assassination in the Hanging Temple, Chen Pingping had smiled and said he was going to let Wu Zhu watch a show. In the end, he did not see it. What show? A show of the Emperor transforming into a great Grandmaster? It looked like the secret that no one in the world knew had still been somewhat guessed by the old cripple closest to the Emperor. But why did he have Wu Zhu put on this show? Wu Zhu began to think. He had many things he wanted to ask the Emperor, but, for a moment, he didn't know where to start. He had so many thoughts that he couldn't pull out a thread. Furthermore, Dong Mountain was not truly calm. Although Ku He and Siga Jian had been heavily injured, they were not dead. Given the Emperor's personality, since he had revealed his final trump card, he would not leave anything behind. Thus, Wu Zhu broke off his thoughts and took a gentle step forward. His step made everyone present feel a glimmer of fear and alarm. Although no one knew who this mysterious black-clothed figure was, the attitudes of the great Grandmasters earlier had already made it clear that he was also a Grandmaster ace. In the current situation, if he suddenly attacked, the 4 great Grandmasters, including the Emperor, would probably all fall into pools of blood. Wu Zhu did not attack. He only looked calmly at the Emperor. The real movement came from the depths of the ancient temple, at the end of the ruins, where the yellow cloth covering Siga Jian suddenly moved. It was as if someone was trying to stand up under the yellow cloth. After losing an arm and suffering from the way of the Emperor's punch, could Siga Jian still stand up? Had a great Grandmaster's body truly surpassed the limits of mortals? The Emperor narrowed his eyes and looked in that direction. Everyone followed the Emperor's gaze and looked in that direction. He was no exception. However, the imperial advisor only smiled bitterly. The yellow cloth was forcefully torn apart. A young man covered in blood crawled out from under the cloth. As he coughed, he tore the yellow cloth into strips. His face was determined and calm. Although it was covered in blood, there was not a glimmer of panic. Although he coughed endlessly, he did not stop the movements of his hands. There were so many eyes on the summit of Dong Mountain, particularly powerful figures who far surpassed mortals, staring at him. However, it was as if he could not feel them at all. He only lowered his head and moved. He was not Siga Jian. He was Siga Jian's last disciple, 13th Wang. Once 13th Wang set his mind on something, he would do it. He had never cared what other people thought or how they would stop him. Thus, as a disciple of the Sword Hut, he had accepted Fan Xian's orders and resisted the rebel army at the mountain gate. He had been sent flying dozens of feet by Yi Luyun, but he still bravely climbed to the summit. He was prepared to continue completing his mission when he saw his teacher's right arm cut off and fall to the ground. Thus, he stood out and tore apart the yellow cloth strips. He carried his heavily injured teacher on his back and used the strips of cloth to bind him tightly. With a crack, his right hand chopped off a thin beam on the ground. Holding it in his hand, he walked out of the door of the old temple and faced everyone on the summit. Sigurd lay on his disciple's body. A large, wretched hole had been punched through his abdomen. Fresh blood poured out and landed on 13th Wang's body. Immediately after, it dripped to the ground. There was a mournful smile on his face, but there was incomparable joy in it. He was on the body of his favorite disciple. 13th Wang, covered in blood, carried his blood-covered teacher. In an instant, the yellow cloth strips were dyed bright red. He held the thin beam in his hand. There was not a glimmer of fear on his face. He only stared fiercely at the middle-aged man in dragon robes. His meaning was simple. He wanted to carry Sigurd down the mountain. Who would stop him? In the mouths of the storytellers of later generations, the battle on Dong Mountain that shocked the world and affected future generations was filled with too many strange changes and killings. The people who participated in this matter were all the most respected figures in the world. Thus, when they talked about it, they were particularly excited. Often, they couldn't finish talking for 3 days and 3 nights. However, what they talked about in these 3 days and 3 nights was basically what happened in 1 second. In this second, the Qing Emperor suddenly attacked, Yi Luyun was heavily injured, and Ku He and Sigurd had no way out. All of the storytellers had forgotten a relatively minor character, 13th Wang. For one, they didn't know the truth of the end of the Dong Mountain battle. For another, compared to these great grandmasters, 13th Wang was an unremarkable character. Although the Qing Emperor had used up a great deal of vital energy, given his great-grandmaster realm, if he wanted to kill 13th Wang, it would be as easy as lifting a hand. However, 13th Wang, this minor character, was still not afraid. He stared viciously into the Qing Emperor's eyes as he gripped the thin beam tightly in his hand. It was as if in the next moment, he was going to use the wooden stick he had picked up on the ground to give the Qing Emperor a shock. Yi Luyun, with a large wound in his abdomen, sat cross-legged not far from the Qing Emperor's side, circulating his qi to heal. Looking at this scene, he couldn't help the glimmer of a smile full of admiration appearing at the corners of his lips. He sighed and said, "What a young man." Sitting cross-legged beside the broken tree, Ku He's bitter smile gradually became clear. No one knew if he was thinking of his true last disciple, Begonia Duo, who was naturally in harmony with nature. He smiled slightly and sighed in admiration. Talented people appear in every generation, and the way of heaven changes. This is the principle. The Qing Emperor looked calmly at the unfamiliar young man. A moment later, he smiled slightly. Then, he gently moved a step to the side and opened up a path for 13th Wang, who was carrying Sigurd on his back. As an emperor and a great grandmaster, he opened up a path for 13th Wang. The dying Sigurd opened his eyes with great difficulty and glanced at the emperor. Some blood seeped out of his lips. The ruthlessness in his weak voice was still there. "How is my disciple?" "Teacher, don't talk anymore." 13th Wang coaxed his teacher like he was a child. He did not immediately choose to go down the mountain after the Qing Emperor unexpectedly opened up a path. Instead, under everyone's shocked gazes, he walked to the Qing Emperor's side, lowered his body, and picked up something. He picked it up naturally as if the Qing Emperor, who was shining brightly, did not exist. What he picked up was Sigurd severed right arm and the normal sword. 13th Wang carried Sigurd on his back. In one hand, he held a severed arm and a sword. In the other, he used a thin beam as his usual green banner. Just like this, he disappeared from the stone path of Dong Mountain. A moment later, the faint sound of Sigurd wild singing and wailing, as well as a ruthless and sorrowful laughter, echoed through the mountain valley and did not stop for a long time. The emperor could kill 13th Wang and not do anything. It was not because he valued talent. Rather, it was because he knew the relationship between this young man and Sigurd Jian laughed and cried. How could he not know this? A dying great-grandmaster, in his last moment, still wanted to see if the Qing emperor would make any mistakes. The emperor had not made any mistakes. There was no need for him to destroy Dongyi's future ahead of time and separate himself from the Qing kingdom's future. Although 13th Wang's determined state of mind moved him, he still did not think much of this young man. He was as confident as ever, arrogant and confident. After today, no one dared to disrespect this confidence. The emperor knew that Sigurd Jian was dead for sure. He knew what kind of damage a full-powered punch of the way of the emperor would bring. Even if Sigurd Jian could linger on for a while, what did a bedridden great-grandmaster with a severed arm count for? Of course, this was still not enough to explain why he would move out of the way. Given his personality, all enemies should be eliminated at the best opportunity. Fan Xian was also not the true reason he was considering. The true reason the emperor did not attack was because Wu Zhu had taken a step forward. Sigurd Jian left. Ku he also left. He floated away. The imperial advisor of Northern Qi floated away to his homeland and painfully waited for the last few days of his life to be tormented. After this battle, 2 of the 4 great grandmasters in the world were gone. The power balance between the 3 powers had finally undergone an earth-shattering change. The biggest obstacle to the Qing kingdom unifying the world would no longer exist. It was not until Ku he had also left the summit of Dong Mountain did Wu Zhu slowly pull back his foot that had stepped forward and his silent threat. In the entire world, only Wu Zhu dared to threaten the Qing emperor at such a time. The Qing emperor looked at him calmly and warmly and said, "Lao Wu, I need an explanation from you." In front of Wu Zhu, the emperor naturally referred to him as Lao Wu and didn't refer to himself as emperor. Wu Zhu slowly lowered his head. A moment later, he said, "I don't like it." This blind great-grandmaster had been recovering on the summit of Dong Mountain for over a year. He seemed to have remembered something. He became more and more talkative, and his expressions became more and more colorful. He was becoming more and more like a normal person. He also began to have emotions that a normal person should have, such as like and dislike. However, his emotions were rather extreme and did not match the coldness on his face. If he didn't like it, then he didn't like it. Who cared about unifying the world? Who cared about the shocking situation you spent 20 years building? If he didn't like it, then don't do it. Young master told me to protect your safety. Wu Zhu raised his head and looked at the emperor through the black cloth. You are safe now. It had been some time since he had called Fan young master. The Qing emperor's expression was calm. There was not a glimmer of anger. He knew that when Lao Wu and Yi Qingmei were in Dongyi, he had some old friendship with Sigurd Jian. As for Ku He also knew that the young lady of the Fan family was still under Ku He's tutelage. However, those 2 great-grandmasters were already crippled and about to die. The Qing emperor was not worried about anything. Calmly, he looked at Wu Zhu and said, "Lao Wu, come back to Jingdo with me." Wu Zhu lowered his head and thought for a moment. A moment later, he raised it and said, "I remember some things, but I don't remember that that person was you." That person was the person who had practiced the upper and lower scrolls of the nameless martial secret. When Fan Xian was young, Wu Zhu had once told him about it. However, he didn't remember who had practiced it. Only now did he remember that it was the Qing emperor. The black cloth on Wu Zhu's face appeared particularly straight. "Goodbye." Wu Zhu said this last goodbye to Yi Luyun, who was sitting cross-legged and healing. After saying this, he gripped the metal drill at his waist with one hand and calmly walked toward the stone steps, beginning to descend the mountain. He didn't say another word to the emperor. He also didn't express farewell to the old temple he had lived in for more than a year. He once again disappeared from the stone steps. Everyone had left. Only the emperor stood alone on the summit of the mountain. Ku He and Sigurd were certain to die today. The plan of many years had been realized. His grand ambition to unify the world was about to begin. However, there was not much joy on the emperor's face. He just stood quietly and welcomed the sun in the sky and the slightly damp sea breeze. He appeared somewhat lonely and desolate. It was lonely to be at the top. It was difficult to find someone who could stand shoulder to shoulder with him. Regardless of who it was, in this instant, they would all feel a strange emotion. However, this kind of emotion did not last long. There were many people who had survived on the summit. Most of the officials who had come to worship heaven were still alive. More than half of the priests in the Qing temple had survived. Although the battle between the great masters was incomparably mysterious, it was strangely controlled within a perfect boundary, other than the last punch in the temples that had been crushed. Only now did the people on the summit shake off their shock. Given their eyesight, it was impossible for them to see clearly what had happened in that instant. Why was Sigurd-Jien's sword just about to pierce into the emperor's body when immediately after, Sigurd-Jien's body was sent flying back like a piece of useless rock? However, they at least knew one truth. The emperor had won. Furthermore, he had won unusually thoroughly. In front of the emperor's power, all schemes and tricks appeared weak and fragile. The future of the Qing kingdom would be like the red sun in the sky above the summit, never sinking. Their faces carried tears and ecstasy as they knelt to the ground and cried out, "Long live!" Amidst the cries, the emperor was calm. His expression did not change at all. To Eunuch Yao, who was the first to stand, he quietly said, "Inform the foot of the mountain to begin, to act. Inform the director to begin." Yes. Send a secret edict to Yanjing. Order Mei Zhili to temporarily act as regent. Order the western camp to press toward the Song border. Order General Shi Fei to bring the edict earlier to the northern expedition camp in Cangzhou to take over the northern expedition army. Yes. Inform Xue Qing to select a number of able officials to go to Luozhou. Tell him that I will wait for him in Ho Yongji's manor. Yes. The emperor had not lost his head at all from today's great victory. Instead, he calmly gave out order after order. The news to Chen Pingping had to be the earliest and the northern expedition army had to be controlled. As for Dongshan Road, as Eunuch Yao lowered his head in acknowledgement, he felt a chill in his heart. It was impossible for Dongshan Road not to know about such a dangerous matter as surrounding Dong Mountain. Governor Ho had probably long colluded with the eldest princess. It looked like the first governor to die a violent death since the founding of the Qing kingdom was going to fall on Ho Yongji's shoulders. All of Dongshan Road was probably going to be bathed in blood from top to bottom by the emperor. No wonder the emperor had Xue Qing travel thousands of li from Jiangnan to send good officials. After calmly and methodically setting up all of this, the Qing emperor finally let out a slow breath. He smiled self-mockingly and shook his head. He then walked in front of Yi Luyun and bowed respectfully. "Thank you for your hard work, Uncle Luyun." Without waiting for Yi Luyun to return the bow, he had already straightened his body and gazed in a daze at the ground that had long been washed clean. Hong Xixiang had died there, but he had not left any traces. For the sake of a noble goal, many people had willingly or passively given up their lives. Eunuch Hong was worthy of the Qing emperor's bow. The scene was a mess. However, the internal court had prepared a lot of things. Eunuch Yao led the officials whose legs were still weak and moved out some things from a side room that had never collapsed. He began to copy and stamp the seal. The emperor's royal seal had already been taken away by Sir Fan Jr., but the emperor's personal seal was still there. Since it was a secret edict, the personal seal was even more effective. After the first wash of the heavy rain, Dong Mountain welcomed the sun. A few white pigeons flew away from the summit of the mountain and circled a few times in the blue sky before flying off in all directions of the Qin kingdom. What they brought was not the news of the flood receding or the will of peace. Instead, it was the transmission of a powerful ruler's will. The flat summit of Dong Mountain had been calm until now. Suddenly, a massive rumble rang out. It didn't shake up any sand or stone, but it did raise some splashes of water. The entire area in the middle of the summit sunk 3 feet. It was as if a god had dropped a hammer and struck it. Only now did the true effect of a battle between great grandmasters reveal its terror and terror. As the two forces intersected, the compressed vital energy seeped into the world and forcefully collided with nature, changing the shape of the land. The emperor didn't look at the large pit. He only raised his head and watched the white pigeons fly in the sky and gradually fly further and further away. His expression was calm and incomparably confident. Chapter 578. The emperor issued a few secret edicts in succession. He then furrowed his brows and said something in a low voice to Eunuch Yao. Eunuch Yao was slightly startled, but his head was lowered very low, terrified of revealing even the slightest inappropriate emotion. The Qing emperor had used himself as bait to kill the 2 great grandmasters in the Dong Mountain situation. Naturally, he was prepared for everything that happened under heaven, such as the 5,000 rebel soldiers at the foot of Dong Mountain and the rebellion that was about to happen in Jingdo. Since the eldest princess had the power to create such a large situation, she would not pass up the opportunity to control the Qin kingdom in one go. This opportunity was bestowed upon her by the emperor. Once the situation developed, if he wanted the Qin kingdom to maintain a stable development, it seemed that the emperor, far away in Dong Mountain, could only rush back to Jingdo and use his supreme authority to stabilize the situation in Jingdo. The emperor had long ambushed provincial soldiers in Jiangbei. It did not involve the movements of the Bureau of Military Affairs. It was all planned in secret with Shui Qing and the governor of Jiangbei Road. Naturally, it would not disturb the power of the Qin family. With such an ambush army, how could the 5,000 rebel soldiers at the foot of Dong Mountain be enough? All of the conspirators saw the emperor as a fierce tiger in a trap. They did not think that this fierce tiger had actually been standing by the side of the trap the entire time, watching coldly as the hunters lost their footing. If the Qing emperor wanted to rush back to Jingdo and forcefully suppress the internal chaos, it would not be difficult. However, when the emperor and Chen Pingping had spoken twice by the palace pillars in front of the royal study and decided on this plan, he had never thought that once he finished the Dong Mountain matter, he would use the army to sweep through Dongshan Road and then return to court to tidy up state affairs. Although the Dong Mountain matter had happened by the seaside, its effects had spread throughout the entire Qin kingdom. For him, this was a rare opportunity. After a long period of planning, the main goal of the Dong Mountain matter was to remove the 2 biggest obstacles to the Qin kingdom's unification of the world. This was the so-called external threat. However, the external threat had been removed. What about the internal threat? This was an opportunity for the emperor. He would use his death to lure out all the restless elements in the court. Once the officials, who usually appeared to be incomparably loyal to him, knew of his death, would they still follow his final edict? Would they still have any respect for him? Would the little person hidden in the darkness and fog jump out now? Just as the emperor had always emphasized to Fan Xian and his sons, he valued people's hearts. The situation in Jingdo was, without question, the best opportunity to test people's hearts. The emperor stood in front of Yi Luyun, who was sitting cross-legged and healing. His expression was calm, but there were slight wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. What he said to eunuch Yao was simple. He was going to send an edict to Chen Pingping to seal off the news. These were the two people the emperor trusted the most. The emperor wanted to see them one last time. Once Fan Xian and Yi Zhong passed this psychological test, they would obtain his absolute trust. However, the emperor on the peak of Dong Mountain had truly not thought that the situation in Jingdo would be so dangerous, that the people in the palace would be so hurt, and that his sister would be so powerful. Yi Luyun sighed and quietly said, "If we don't hurry back to Jingdo, I'm afraid there will be great chaos. In order to achieve great governance, there must first be great chaos." Using a storm of blood and wind to wash out the gold from the yellow sand and forge a united, iron-like Qing kingdom could lay a good foundation for the war to unify the land in 2 or 3 years. The Qing emperor did not think much of such a price. However, he also did not underestimate his sister. He knew that if this happened, the entire Qing kingdom would probably sink into a storm. "I fought for this land," the emperor said coldly. "Even if Yunrui sits firmly in Jingdo, I can still fight back." After these words were said, the emperor didn't say anything more. After coughing, he slowly walked toward the bloodstained mountain gate at the foot of Dong Mountain with eunuch Yao's support. The signal arrow had already been raised. The sounds of killing rang out again at the foot of the mountain. The officials and attendants accompanying the heaven worship came down the mountain with faces full of fear. A number of people had already made a stretcher. Humbly, they helped Yi Luyun lie down. The transmission of information in this era was unusually slow. Chen Pingping, far away in Jingdo, had already arranged everything. The Overwatch Council was powerful enough to seal off any true information from Dong Mountain Road. The emperor had calculated that at the beginning of the rebellion, his proud and crazy sister would send news of his death back to Jingdo and push the entire situation into a crazy situation from which there was no way to recover. Since the eldest princess had started the Dong Mountain incident, regardless of whether the emperor was alive or dead, she had to handle all matters in Jingdo with the mentality that the emperor was already dead. This was the madness of staking everything on one throw. However, Ku He and Sigurd Jian were still alive. The 5,000 rebel soldiers at the foot of the mountain and the Jiaozhou Navy rebel army on the sea could not be completely destroyed. At most, in another 7 days, the true situation at Dong Mountain would get out. Given the distance between the two places and the Overwatch Council's ability to seal off information along the way, in about 30 days, the people of Jingdo would know of this earth-shattering news. At that time, the eldest princess would presumably have already started for a dozen days. No one knew if Jingdo could be held. As the emperor walked silently down the mountain, he thought about all of this. Although he was confident, he still did not want his Jingdo or his Qin kingdom to see too much turmoil. Comparing the two, he was still willing to take a risk and see the sincerity hidden in the deepest parts of people. He wanted to see the power of people, particularly Fan Xian's. He wanted to see whether or not Fan Xian could understand the heart of a monarch and help the emperor guard his homeland. He had not thought that Fan Xian would fight a beautiful battle but be restrained by the eldest princess with even more beautiful methods. In the end, Fan Xian had guessed the emperor's thoughts. However, the methods he used to protect his Jingdo home were things the emperor had never expected or wanted to see. No matter how the emperor calculated, he still missed one thing. It was the Empress Dowager's attitude. This emperor, famous for his filial piety and known to rule the world through filial piety, had forgotten that his mother was actually like him. She would forever place the Qing kingdom and the survival of the royal family first. Other than his own life, it was more important. Before he went down the mountain, the emperor, who had just obtained the greatest success of his life, still calmly gave one last order: capture alive the leader of the rebel army at the foot of the mountain. Although the black-clothed man at the foot of the mountain was not a great grandmaster, he was another important figure in the Qing emperor's heart. Wang Qinian lowered his head and fled down the mountain through the dense forest in the wind and rain. Before Ku He's first palm landed on old eunuch Hong's chest, this Overwatch Council official, who had seen the opportunity quickly, had secretly slipped down the mountain while no one was paying attention. He was known as the Two Wings of the Overwatch Council. Back then, he had been a great bandit who had swept through Dongyi and northern Qi. When he did this kind of sneaky action, it was truly sharp. The sharp edges of the leaves brushed past his body. Although they were unable to cut through the Overwatch Council's special robes, they still shocked him. He didn't know what would happen at the top of the mountain. He only knew that such a scene was not something someone of his level should be prying into or curious about. In his opinion, the emperor was dead for sure. No one could survive the combined attack of 3 great grandmasters. Thus, he decided to flee at the first opportunity. His thoughts were simple. He had to send this shocking news to Jingdo at the first opportunity. Although he didn't know if he would be able to run into Fan Xian, who was also fleeing, he had to at least notify Director Qin. Jumping over a call, he cautiously used the wind, rain, and trees as cover. He had already come to the middle of the mountain without a sound. At this moment, he heard a muffled sound at the top of the mountain followed by the sound of a bell. It was the moment the Qing Emperor had punched out with the way of the Emperor's killing fist and Sigurd Jian's heavily injured body crashed into the ancient temple's bronze bell. Wang Qinian paused and continued to lower his head. He hadn't walked for long when he felt some movement behind him. Unconsciously, he hid his body in a pile of weeds and watched the slanted stone path in the distance. 2 bloody people walked down the stone path. Wang Qinian was familiar with the young man. It was 13th Wang, whom he had interacted with for a long time in Jiangnan. Who was on his back? Wang Qinian's eyes widened. Listening to the weak but comical conversation between the 2 bloody people, he finally knew who 13th Wang was carrying. The bloody person with the broken arm was 13th Wang's teacher. Wang Qinian was Fan Xian's most trusted aide. He even knew about the matter of the chest. Naturally, he also knew 13th Wang's true identity. 13th Wang was the last disciple of Dongyi's Sigurd Jian. Then, his teacher was Sigurd Jian. Wang Qinian's shocked pupils constricted. He didn't even dare to breathe loudly. He could only calmly watch this strange and sorrowful pair of teacher and disciple walk down the stone step by step. A moment later, he came back to his senses. He was still slightly absent-minded. He wondered what had happened on the summit of the mountain. Who in this world could injure Sigurd Jian to such an extent? Before Wang Qinian could wake up from his shock, a hemp-clothed figure floated down the mountain in a strange posture. Wang Qinian looked at this scene and almost vomited blood. What was going on with Master Ku He? Magic? Looking at this old bald donkey's face, why was it like a zombie's? 2 great grandmasters had walked past Wang Qinian's eyes one after another. Furthermore, they had left in such a dejected manner. Perhaps they had already discovered Wang Qinian's hiding like a field mouse. At this moment, how could the 2 great grandmasters who didn't have long to live have the energy to pay attention to him? However, Wang Qinian was extremely shocked. He couldn't understand how the 2 grandmasters, who had charged to the top of East Mountain like gods, could become like this in such a short time. After a long time, he straightened his body with trembling legs and turned his head toward the peak of Dong Mountain that rose into the clouds. He thought to himself, had the emperor won? Perhaps he should return to the summit of the mountain to see what had happened. However, the shock in his heart and a faint sense of fear urged his legs to continue walking down the mountain. Past noon and into the night, the sounds of killing rose up from all directions at the foot of the mountain. Wang Qinian, who had been hiding in the darkness like a bat, finally took the opportunity to break out of the battlefield. He finally confirmed the reality that the emperor was still alive and well. The rebellion had failed. The great grandmasters were doomed. He made a decision on his own. He would no longer follow the heaven worship procession. Instead, he ran toward Jingdo as fast as he could. He had to tell Fan Xian the truth of this matter and provide background information that Sir Fan Jr. could use for reference. Only then could he prevent Fan Xian from making an unforgivable mistake in Jingdo. Wang Qinian was an official of the Overwatch Council and an official of the Emperor. He was certain of only one identity. He was Fan Xian's trusted aide. He knew too many things about Fan Xian and too many thoughts. He was very afraid that Fan Xian would make some wrong decisions because of the Emperor's death. It was just like how the Jiaozhou Navy Admiral Su Maokai had advised Fan Xian to make a decision on the boat. For some reason, Wang Qinian guessed the Emperor's thoughts. He was terrified and worried for Fan Xian and everyone in Jingdo. Thus, he used the fastest speed and experienced countless twists and turns to rush back to Jingdo. He rushed ahead of the Overwatch Council and the eldest princess spies. Carrying this world-shaking news, he came to Chen Garden. He was the first person in the world to spread this news. In the end, he did not spread this news. The old cripple of the Overwatch Council had directly tied him up and gagged his mouth, not giving him any chance to spread the news. In the few days after the old cripple learned of the situation on Dong Mountain, he developed a new habit. He often sighed to his old servant. You have to know that it is not an easy thing to make a person die. When Wang Qinian prepared to slip down the mountaintop, Gauda had already slipped away. These trusted aides at Fan Xian's side had, without question, been infected with too much of Fan Xian's scent. They were different from most people in this world. In the depths of their hearts, they had already unconsciously begun to view their own lives as more important than the emperor's. In a society with imperial power, this was a rebellious thought. Although Fan Xian had never said it explicitly, the way he did things in secret from the court and the imperceptible influence he had on the words and actions of the people at his side all showed this point. When Gauda trembled as he fled down the mountain, he had certainly not thought of this. Like Wang Qinian, he did not see Sigurd Jian and Ku He's heavily injured figures. However, he had discovered the truth of the matter at the foot of the mountain. He was afraid and terrified because his and Wang Qinian's identities were different. The officials of the Overwatch Council were the Emperor's subjects, while the Tiger Guards were the Emperor's servants, or perhaps, the last layer of protection. Wang Qinian could run, but the Tiger Guards could not, particularly when the Emperor's life was in danger. For the Tiger Guards, fleeing in the face of battle was a kind of humiliation and a monstrous crime. Perhaps Gauda could lessen the feeling of humiliation in his heart, but he could not avoid this crime. The stone path was covered with the bodies of the Tiger Guards and shattered blades. All of his colleagues had died on Dong Mountain. When he faintly understood the result of the assassination at the mountaintop, Gauda became angry, hurt and afraid. 100 Tiger Guards had died just like that. When had the Emperor ever cared about their lives? Gauda's heart was cold. He knew that he would never be able to return to the Emperor's side. Once he showed himself, what awaited him would be the severe punishment of the Qing law and palace rules. Not only would he die, but perhaps even his family would be implicated. Thus, he chose to flee even more resolutely. He trusted Fan Xian, but he could not return to Fan Xian's side because he didn't want to bring any trouble to Sir Fan Jr. He only wanted to leave the unfathomable royal palace and the emperor whose power could not be offended. He wanted to go to a distant place and live the rest of his life in peace. At the end of the Dong Mountain incident, 2 of Fan Xian's trusted aides chose their own paths. At the time, it did not attract much attention. No one had even noticed this. But when it came to things like life, who could say anything about it? Every sip and every peck was destined. The cause sown today would bear a bitter fruit in the future. While Gao De and Wang Qinian were running on the road, the thousands of rebel soldiers at the foot of Dong Mountain and the 9th-level assassins in Dongyi were also on the road to escape. The Jiaozhou Navy ships on the sea had not yet entered the deep ocean when they were blocked off by the ships that Xiaozhou had sent over. Although the combined fighting power of the two provincial soldiers was far from that of Yan Xiaoyi's personal longbow soldiers, the most important thing in a battle between two armies was momentum. Ku He and Siga Jian, two figures who were like gods in the hearts of common soldiers, had both met such a tragic end. What would these rebel soldiers, who had betrayed the emperor, think? When the emperor, wearing a bright yellow dragon robe, and Yi Luyun, who had been the protector of the Qing kingdom for decades, walked out of the mountain and appeared in front of the rebel soldiers, this rebellion had already come to an end. The military had not moved, but their morale had already been defeated. Thousands of rebel soldiers stood at the foot of Dong Mountain in fear and helplessness. The roads leading to the wilderness had already been surrounded by layers of provincial soldiers who had come on orders. They knew they had no way out, but they could not summon up the last of their courage to carry out the last struggle of their lives. His Majesty's words shattered everything they had. I will pardon you all from the death penalty. Regardless of whether they believed it or not, this was still a sweet, poisonous fruit. The rebel army abandoned their weapons and surrendered, but it was unknown how they would be massacred and cleansed in the next 2 years. When the provincial soldiers began to surround them, before the Qing emperor had come down the mountain, the Qing emperor had not yet come down the mountain. After attacking the mountain, Yun Jilan and a group of Dongyi assassins still had a dozen people left. They received Siga Jian, who 13th Wang had bravely carried down from the mountain. Knowing the truth at the summit, they broke away from the rebel army with chills all over their bodies and began to kill their way into the woods in the north. Such a group indeed had a powerful killing power. They successfully broke through the perimeter and entered the secret mountain paths that used to be Danzhou. The Qing emperor was a person, not a god. Even if he could calculate everything, in order to give the eldest princess a chance and for the bigger picture, he could not take care of everything. There were too many cracks appearing within the Qing kingdom. It was a foolish dream to want to wipe out all the opposing forces in one fell swoop. He was not surprised by Dongyi's breakthrough. However, the Qing emperor had given an order to the black-clothed commander of the rebel army because he was very interested in him. Even though he knew the chances of capturing him were not high, he still had to try. Master Ku He, with an inauspicious yellow face, was sitting behind the black-clothed man's horse and following him out of the encirclement. For a Grand Master to be so dispirited, a glimmer of sorrow flashed through the black-clothed man's eyes. Because of the Qing emperor's order, the pursuit of the black-clothed commander was the strongest. Although the provincial soldiers were not very powerful and the Tiger Guards had all died, the Qing emperor's troops finally succeeded in blocking the black-clothed commander at an intersection. It seemed to be a dead end. The other party had at least 300 soldiers. It seemed impossible to kill them all. The sounds of pursuit rose again from behind. The Qing emperor wanted to capture him alive. Once he could not, so what if he killed him? The black-clothed man had led the Northern Expedition Army to surround the mountain. He had only brought 2 trusted soldiers. However, this person led unfamiliar subordinates and was able to divide and surround the imperial army, not allowing a single one of them to escape. It could truly be said that he was a godly commander. In the end, the momentum on the battlefield was like a landslide. Even if he had extraordinary abilities, he could not make Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers overcome the respect and fear they felt toward the emperor and Yi Luyun. In the end, they still lost. Looking at the hundreds of soldiers in front of him, the black-clothed man, who had always appeared calm and gentle during the encirclement of the mountain, finally slowly straightened his body and carefully tied Master Ku He to his back. The 2 trusted soldiers beside him each held an object wrapped in cloth. After untying the layers of coarse cloth, they revealed a metal rod about the length of an arm inside. The black-clothed man calmly accepted it with both hands and put it together with a clang. With a wave of one hand, killing intent surged. A long, black metal spear suddenly appeared in his hand. With the spear in his hand, a powerful fighting spirit abruptly exploded from his calm eyes. His entire body also began to emanate a murderous aura. He was like a god of war. He squeezed the sides of his horse. Alone with Kuhi on his back, he charged toward the 300 soldiers. His aura was like thunder and could not be stopped. It was as if he had returned to that night in Shangjing, when the rain fell as arrogantly. 2 of his trusted soldiers died, but he escaped with Kuhi on his back, a provincial general reported in a trembling voice as he knelt in front of the Qing emperor. You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.